Hello, listeners. I hope you are having a good day today. So, yeah, I made a whoopsie. I have Google documents that include whatever story I will post, and have lines highlighted in a specific color for each role, and I forgot to highlight some character lines for another voice actor. They didn't see the line due to it not being highlighted, obviously, and I have to wait for them to get back to me with the audio before I can get back into production for the next story I'm featuring. So, in the meantime, I decided to do another scary story compilation with a theme like the last video. I hope you don't mind while you wait for new content. I have another story I'm working on too, but it's been like over a week since I've posted, and if I were to do a new story now, that's just gonna take longer for me to post something, so yeah. But hey, maybe one of the stories included in this compilation is one you've never heard before. In any event, I really do appreciate your patience and support. It truly means the world, and I am sorry for any inconvenience. So, with that being said, enjoy the video. I was aroused from my dozing by an uncomfortable burning sensation in my right eye, only to realize that I was nodding off with my cigarette burning in an ashtray nearby, and the smoke was trailing up into my eye. Rubbing it, I yawned and picked up the cigarette to finish it off. My desk clock glared at me, telling me it was 2:15 in the morning. I decided I should probably try to get a couple of hours worth of shut-eye. Going on like this every night wasn't doing me any good. I was running out of coffee, too. The light from my PC was pretty bright, and I had to squint as I closed out of Google after having no luck finding anything out of the ordinary on the tunnels. They were a couple of miles long, far underground. An abandoned sewage network in Warwick, which hadn't seen use in about 7 years. That was all I found. They were always nothing special. Until now, of course. I like to call myself a freelance journalist. Probably not a very good one by the standards of most, but I get by. I've always scraped along on the lesser-known happenings in the city. Nothing major. I had run into a case that really had my interest, though. After 7 years of relevant silence and abandonment, the tunnels had claimed 3 teenagers well known for messing about in there, doing graffiti, smoking, and doing all the things teenagers do when they find a nice place where they're left alone. Now they were gone. The parents had filed missing persons reports after 48 hours as per the standard, and so the police had started poking around and hadn't found much of anything. I had heard about it from my downstairs neighbor in the apartment building I lived in, and was instantly intrigued, so I did some sniffing around myself. I managed to locate the tunnels and found 2 entrances that weren't closed off in different parts of the city. I took a drive down the one off Wisham Street, down in a public park sector. Upon arriving, a couple of police officers stood outside the entrance, and they looked my way as I approached.
"Excuse me, sir. You shouldn't be down here,"
said the dark-haired burly one on the left. "My apologies, officers. I didn't know anyone was here."
"That's all right. This area is closed off for now. It's currently under investigation."
"I did hear about it. Some kids disappeared down there? That's never happened before, has it?"
"Sorry, sir. We're not inclined to discuss anything related to this case. Just need you to move along. Let us handle this."
"I just wanted to look around a little myself, see if I could find anything that may help."
"That's our job, sir. We will handle it. Please leave the area,"
said the officer, firmly this time. I decided to give it up for now, as they weren't going to budge, and as I was leaving, they even mentioned the other entrance and told me that was being watched as well, and warned me not to go there. I cursed a little when I was back in my car. It was one of the reasons I had always avoided cases of intrigue. They were usually more troublesome than anything else, and the cops always got in the way. I went home and ended up spending a few days scraping around online, falling asleep at my desk. I even checked the city's public records, and nothing odd came up. Eventually, I hit a stroke of luck after finding out the name of one of the parents of the teenagers, Amelia Gardner, mother of Errol Gardner, 14 years old. After finding their address listed in the phone book, I took the short drive to Herwin, number 18, Regal Street. My knock on the front door was answered by a sullen, slightly graying woman, probably in her late 40s. My first impression was that she seemed tired, just really tired. She looked at me without saying anything, so I spoke first. Hi, I'm sorry to bother you. Are you Mrs. Gardner?
Yes. Who are you?
My name is Adam. I'm one of the people interested in the case involving the
tunnels. I've already answered all the questions I can. The police are busy with it right now.
Yes, ma'am, they are. But they aren't having much luck as of yet, and I'm only trying to help if I can. May I just ask you a few questions? I'll be out of your hair as quick as possible. She stared at me for a while, and I was sure she was going to start shouting and telling me to go away. But she sighed and let me into her home.
You can have a seat. Would you like some tea?
Yes, please, I said, anxious to start questioning her, but also wanting her to be as comfortable to talk as possible. I took a seat on the sofa and waited. After a few minutes, she came back with the tea and sat down.
What do you want to know?
She asked. I got my notepad out. Your son, Errol, was one of the 3 teens to go missing down in the tunnels. Were you aware of the fact that he was hanging around there?
Yes. He started going there a lot recently with that Jared and that girl Emma. Those 2 were always trouble since he met them. I told him many times that I didn't want him going there. But you know, teenagers do what they want.
I understand. Was he close friends with the other 2?
He's known Jared since elementary. As for the girl, she's a new one. I don't think either of the boys have known her long. She sure is a strange one.
Can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
She just behaved really strange sometimes. There was a couple times that Errol told me he thought he had seen her standing outside in the backyard, late at night for some reason, looking at the house, but he was never sure. He always said he thought he had seen her, but when he checked again, she was gone. I never saw her myself, except when she came to meet them during the day.
That is rather strange. And you can't think of any possibilities yourself? How they could have met?
No, she just came out of nowhere.
Mrs. Gardner looked at me with tired eyes, and I could see a hint of sadness and worry under her calm disposition.
Do you think they're gonna find my boy, Adam?
Ma'am, I believe they're going to do their very best, and I'm going to do the best I can too. They're not approving of me poking around, as you can imagine, but that won't stop me.
Thank you. I know you don't have to, but I appreciate your help all the same.
Mrs. Gardner saw me out when we were done, and I went home to plan my next move. The bit about the strange girl, Emma, was intriguing. From the way it sounded, she had been the one to constantly influence the 2 boys to visit the tunnels. That made me curious indeed. I fell to thinking about how to gain access with the police watching the place. It was definitely risky, but it had to be done. It was the only way to find out more. I decided I would have to go at night. I wasn't exactly excited to go and visit some pitch-black abandoned tunnels that stretched for miles in the dead of night, let me tell you. But I was at a brick wall otherwise. That night found me in my car around 10 p.m. with a backpack containing 2 flashlights, a bunch of batteries, and a few other tools I thought I might need. I took my bolt cutters along as well. I was lost in thought in the dark quietness on my drive down to the entrance area. I ran my plan through my head over and over as I went. Once I got there, I drove past the entrance casually, scanning the area. And as I expected, a police officer sat not far off. I glanced in at the windows and saw the officer inside, doing something on his phone. I drove a little further, around the block, and left my car in the parking area of a convenience store not far off. From what I could tell, the officer in the cruiser hadn't paid any special attention to me passing by. I took my backpack with all my equipment and made my way down the street. My nerves were a little unsettled by the darkness, and knowing what I was up to could get me in some real trouble. But this is what I was meant for. It had been a few days and the cops had found nothing. It was my turn. I clung to the side of the road, getting poked and prodded in the bushes there, but I managed to make my way past the police cruiser and down the dirt path to the tunnel entrance without incident. Standing there, looking at the rusty metal gate, a wind blew around me, howling softly down the dark void of the tunnel. I was even less excited now that I was here, but I went into professional mode. I once more made certain that no one knew I was here before I grabbed the bolt cutters out of my backpack and eyed the lock on the chain securing the grate to the wall. It was just your average bronze-colored lock you would put on your gate. You would think they would take special precaution to make sure no one got in, but they probably didn't expect anyone would want to be creeping around here at night. They must have forgotten about me already. Good. I took a deep breath and clamped the cutters down on the bar of the lock. It snapped with a metallic clang that echoed down the tunnel. My eyes were shut tight as the sound drifted away into the darkness, and I stayed perfectly still, my ears on high alert for any sound telling me I'd been discovered. I waited a full 2 minutes, and when everything was still quiet, I breathed easier again. I took the chain off the grate as quietly as possible, and put the bolt cutters back in my backpack. Apart from a slight metal screech that made my skin crawl, I managed to get the grate open before waiting a while again, to make sure the sound hadn't given me away. I decided not to pull the grate closed behind me after I went in, as every noise was a risk, and I had made enough already. After making some cautious progress away from the entrance, I turned on one of the flashlights. The beam revealed the murky dark gray of the tunnel walls circling all around me, and the moist, slimy floor beneath my feet. Apparently some water must have traveled through here due to overflowing and such, causing the floor to stay slimy and wet. I moved slowly to make sure I didn't slip. I checked my watch. It was just after 11 p.m. If my flashlight wasn't on, it would be pitch black. So much so that I wouldn't have been able to see my own hand in front of my face. Hence me bringing 2 in case something happened to one of them. After walking around for 15 minutes, I took a bend veering to the left, and the flashlight beam revealed an old maintenance room door. Interested, I stepped onto a metal platform to have a look. It was terribly rusted, unused for who knows how long. I got a crowbar from my backpack and tried it on the door. I tried everywhere I could, straining to get some leverage and get it open, but I had to give up. I wasn't going to be able to get it open, at least not alone. I figured that if it was tightly shut, there wouldn't be anything of interest on the other side. I was putting the crowbar back when my heart stopped after I heard a sound somewhere down the tunnel. In my fright, I ended up dropping the crowbar and it hit the metal platform I was standing on with a deafening clang that resonated down the tunnel. I stood there for a while, mouth open, staring at the crowbar in horror, not moving an inch, barely even daring to breathe. The sound I had heard was the sound of footsteps, like someone running through a wet, sloshy part of the tunnel. And now it was dead quiet again. My mind was racing. Who could it be? Surely the police wouldn't be searching here now. They had been at it for days, and I was barely a 20-minute walk into the tunnel. Why would they still be searching this close to the entrance? I'm not afraid to admit I was scared out of my wits. The sound of the crowbar hitting the platform was still screaming in my mind. There was no way whoever it was didn't hear that. If I heard them moving, they definitely heard it. I eventually pulled myself together and picked up the crowbar, holding it tightly and listening. There was only silence. I had an internal battle of will, trying to decide whether to just leave and try again the next day, or continue on. I was overpowered by the thought that I may not be able to return the next day after my breaking in was discovered in the morning. Also, what if that was one of the lost kids trying to find a way out? I would have risked all my effort being for nothing if I left there and then. Still shaken, I stepped slowly off the platform and back into the tunnel, and continued further in. I know most people in their right mind would have been out of there so fast they would have been nothing but a blur. Maybe I was never in my right mind to begin with. I decided to stay on a fairly straight path, avoiding turning too much so I wouldn't have an issue finding my way back out. I stopped in my tracks, my heart stopping with me again when I heard another noise echoing my way from the direction I just came. I stood absolutely still. Then I heard it coming from behind me again, running. It got louder and louder, and my eyes widened as I shone my flashlight down the tunnel, straining to see beyond the reach of it, where it was pitch black. I screamed in terror when a shape came barreling into view, so fast I couldn't see what it was. It blew right past me, knocking me hard into the wall of the tunnel and disappearing fast the way I had come. I sat there on the floor for a while after the sound died off, trying not to kill myself through hyperventilation. I can't describe the terror I felt. I won't try. It must have been at least 5 minutes before I got up again and tried to move. My body was limp with fear and wouldn't cooperate. As I was getting up, I almost fainted when I heard more noises coming from the way back. I was sure it must have been some sort of animal. Maybe a feral dog. It had been so fast and it hadn't attacked me, so I couldn't be sure. I got up and began slowly tracking the other sounds I could hear. They were faint, not nearly as clear as what I had heard before, but as I got closer, I realized they were coming from below me somewhere. Shining my flashlight at the floor as I walked, I stared when I found a hatch in the floor, leading down. There was no doubt that this was where the sound was coming from. I got the crowbar and decided to open it, my fear ebbing away, and was replaced by adrenaline as I felt that this was it. This was the reason why I had come here. I managed to fight the rusty hatch open and climb down after seeing another tunnel section below after scanning with my flashlight. I made sure to remember exactly where the hatch was before walking. I rounded a corner and found myself in a suddenly open area, a sort of junction between tunnels with a round open space in between. I'm not about to expect anyone to believe what I saw as I stood there, but it won't ever leave my mind. Such things shouldn't even be possible. But here it was. Lying on the ground towards the center were two bodies. They lay very still, seemingly dead. Just beyond the beam of my flashlight, there was something moving near the bodies. I was horrified and scared out of my mind, but I couldn't move. That was when whatever was moving came into view. A horrible, dark green mass was moving along the floor, its body pulsating as it moved, like a worm did. It made an awful clicking and gurgling sound as it did so. It seemed to not notice me standing there with the flashlight. It moved towards one of the bodies just as another came into view, squelching along the ground. As I watched, the first one I had seen slithered onto the body of what looked like a young boy. I began retching as it started to push its way inside to the mouth of the boy. Paralyzed, I watched as it forced its way further and further into the mouth of the body, stretching and convulsing as it entered. After a lot of gurgling, shaking, and more awful convulsions, the creature had disappeared entirely inside the body. That was when the body slowly stood up and staggered slightly before standing straight. The head turned slowly towards me, and its eyes opened. It was at this moment, seeing that, and seeing the other creature entering the other body, that shook me to my core and sent me running. I flew back down towards the hatch, climbed up it at incredible speed, and slammed it down before running, screaming back down the tunnel. For a few awful moments, I thought I may have been running the wrong way, further into the tunnel, but I ended up passing by the old maintenance door again, to my unimaginable relief, and kept running. I got to the entrance and fell out of it, scrambling in the dirt, truly believing a lumbering corpse would just appear to drag me back in. After I got away from the entrance, I could think of nothing else but finding my car and going home. I know I should have gone and told the officer in the cruiser what had just happened, but he would have never believed me, and I would have been in a lot of trouble. By some good grace of the heavens, I managed to struggle up the road back to my car and drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, eyes wide, mouth open in shock and horror. Whatever I saw that night is something that will stay with me until the day I die. But I don't want to take that awful secret to my grave, as I may never rest if I do. To make things worse, 2 days after that night, I found out that one of the missing teens had come home. Errol Gardner had returned home. It was reported that he was found to be sick, starving, and catatonic, but alive. He didn't respond to any outside stimuli for the time being. Medical experts believe that it was the shock and trauma. But you and I know better, don't we? I don't know what will happen now, but whatever that is, it's not what they think it is. That thing lying in that hospital bed is not Errol Gardner. The parents have it the hardest. First, they have to figure out the powers, the visions, whatever it might be. If they're lucky, they're put in contact with us before it gets serious. If they're unlucky, they can lose everything. One girl, a real nasty job, I didn't even get to meet. By the time I turned up, the whole family had been crammed into the oven and the house had burned down. We had to peel them out of it, one by one, like giant fruit roll-ups. We think she was a pyro, but who knows? We weren't there. We try to do some outreach, but it's hard with the government mandates stopping us from going public. Although it's not always how you might think. We're not like the Men in Black or anything. The truth is that when the supernatural turns up on your doorstep, you'll likely choose not to believe it. And if you do, then no one else will believe you. That's what I mean about the parents. They're isolated from friends, family, even each other. These kids aren't X-Men, levitating remotes or mowing the lawn with their minds. It's stressful, sometimes even terrifying to live with. It's not easy when your 6-year-old tells you the date and time of your death, or you give them a bad row and the following morning you wake up with an abscess the size of a tennis ball filling your mouth like a ball gag. And that stuff can happen even when the kid doesn't mean it to. Their thoughts and emotions just leak out. And kids, well, they can have some pretty messed up thoughts. We have a pamphlet, more of a book, really, where we run through some of the common mistakes that parents make. It's funny to read if you don't know what's at stake. Introducing your gifted child to the concept of death as early as possible is essential to long-term safety. Examples of traditional folklore you should avoid discussing with your child include that their deceased goldfish have gone to live in the sea, that dogs, cats, rabbits, etc. are now living happily on a farm, that deceased grandparents have gone to a better place. It goes on, but you get the gist. No two kids are alike, but they ruminate on the little things. Phrases like a better place can become real to them in a way they'll never be for an adult. They start to picture things, start to think of what it might be like, what it should be like. But a brain isn't just a long line of thoughts. It's like an ocean, and there are depths filled with things out of sight. Even a kid's mind. Add in fact that most kids are a lot smarter and knowledgeable than their parents think, and, well, what do you think a better place should be? Have you ever been to a funeral? Seen a corpse? Kids know more than you think. They visit grandma in a parlor somewhere, everyone's crying, everyone's sad, and their mother won't let them open the box to see the old woman who gave them candy every week. Does that seem like a better place to you? All the black, all the tears, being lowered into a hole in the ground and covered with dirt. One of my early cases was a young girl, sweet as can be. She could occasionally tell the future in very specific terms. Her parents, bless them, hoped it'd lead to a better life, but they made the mistake of asking when they'd die, and the answer wasn't what they wanted. It broke my heart to visit that little girl, to sit and play the Wii with her, laugh with her, then look back at the kitchen and see her mother standing there with a distant look in her eyes. The little girl couldn't understand why her parents jumped when she looked at them, or shivered when she hugged them. They still loved her, but you could see they'd spent every second of every day counting down the moments. It was up to me to make sure the little girl understood the reality of death. That much I managed. I remember her little frown as she did the maths. She'd been confused for weeks by that point, but her parents refused to answer her questions. I answered them all, and honestly at that. "It's not really a better place then, is it?" she asked. "I don't know," I answered. "I'm not even sure it is a place." "I shouldn't have told Mommy about the yellow car," she whispered, her eyes tearing up as her little mind grasped such a big idea. "Mommy shouldn't have asked," I replied a little too quickly, letting my emotions rise to the surface. I hoped that'd be the end of it. I figured with any luck the mother and father would learn to live with what they knew and not drive themselves mad thinking about how to avoid it. Most people, though, they get so blinded by the specifics, they don't see the big picture. That woman could have locked herself up in a bank vault to avoid being run over by the taxi her daughter described, only to drop dead from a heart attack a day later. I tried explaining that to them. I tried explaining that worrying won't change a thing. At least it's not supposed to. A few weeks later, I returned for another welfare check, and guess who answered the door? The little girl, looking hungry and ragged. In the kitchen, all the cupboard doors had been thrown open, and she'd clearly started hacking away at old tins of food with a knife. There were even empty packs of pasta where she'd been eating the stuff dry and uncooked. At first I thought her parents had killed themselves, and she'd been forced to survive on her own for a short while. But when I asked her, I got an answer that made my blood run cold. "I sent them to a better place," she said. "You killed them?" I asked, wondering exactly what these parents had asked of their own child. "No, silly," she answered. "An actual better place. I pictured them in the bestest place in the whole world, and I made them go there." "What's the bestest place in the whole world?" "A beach," she cried. "A beach that goes on forever and ever in all directions, and you can eat as much as you want because the grass grows fruit and candy, and there's no one to tell you what to do, so Daddy never has to go to work again. And Mommy never has to worry about being fat because no one will ever see her get bigger, and Daddy will love her no matter what, because he said so, and..." How did you send them there? She held up a piece of paper with blue crayon and beige lines scribbled all over the place. It was a kid's interpretation of the beach, an explosion of colors and poorly drawn shapes that composed the background. The foreground, however, was something completely different. There were two black and white photorealistic figures, frozen in time, hands held to the sides of their head as a silent scream escaped their lips. "And the best thing about the better place?" The little girl beamed with pride. "You can never, ever, ever, ever die. No matter how far you fall or how long you hold your breath, or even if you eat loads and loads of poison." Bless her. She looked so proud of what she'd done. Every now and again, I pull that picture out and look at the girl's parents. They move so long as you're not looking directly at them. They push at the boundaries of the page, sometimes even go around the other side. At first they screamed and screamed, and that was all I ever saw. But for the last few years they started just lying there next to each other, staring at what I can only guess to be the sky. I'm not sure. I'm not even sure time moves normally for them. There's something that looks like a tally in the sand. If it is, the count is bigger than anything possible, whether it's days or years. I'll burn it one day. I just need to feel confident it's the right thing to do. I still hold out hope the girl will come back and pull them out. Worse for wear, but ultimately alive. I lost contact with her when she turned 13, though. Most of these kids don't stick around into adolescence because they don't have to. and the system is rough at the best of times. I wish I knew where they went. I like to think the government rounds them up and finds them a place where they can help the world with their powers. But most of these kids aren't cut out to be fry cooks, let alone super soldiers. Whatever purpose they find in life, I'm not so sure it's for anyone else's benefit. Part of my job is minimizing the threat these kids pose to relatives and society at large. Easier said than done, of course. It's not just that there's all this power condensed into a half-formed brain. It's what they represent to the average person. In the movies, if some gravedigger spots the undead, grandma hauling her ass out of the ground and shuffling towards the horizon, all you have to do is spray him with whiskey and hope no one believes him. That last part holds out, but not the first. Do you know what the average person does when faced with proof of the afterlife? What do you think happens when the average person happens to catch a glimpse of what's in Grandma's eyes? Or, God forbid, they get the chance to exchange a few words with the formerly deceased. Kids who speak to the dead can be the worst because it turns out, whatever's on the other side, it drives the average person fucking insane. And I don't just mean talking to yourself insane. It's more like slit the throats of your family and castrate yourself with a razor blade insane. You might think you've accepted the idea of nothingness, or the idea of heaven or hell. But the truth, I'm not so sure it can even fit inside one person's head. The glimpse I had was bad enough to net me 6 months in a mental health facility. It started when some poor boy had brought his grandfather back without even realizing. He just thought about it long enough, hard enough, and it happened. Next thing was I got a phone call from the parents who'd locked themselves in the bathroom. They needed help. And even though I was on probationary training, I didn't call up my supervisor. I just rushed out. Truth is, I didn't want to call my boss. I didn't want to be supervised. I'd been waiting for this opportunity ever since I read about it in the training. I wanted to see someone who'd come back to life. I wanted to know what was on the other side. All the guys talked about it, about people coming back, but I hadn't really thought they were being serious. It certainly seemed like they weren't being honest with me. I made the mistake of treating it as a problem that could be solved for X. I thought having an answer would do something, help me in some way. I managed to find Grandpa staring at the bathroom door, formaldehyde leaking out of his asshole and dripping onto the floor. Those eyes looked at me with an unspeakable hatred, a venomous glare bad enough to make me stumble back, keeping far out of his reach. But it wasn't enough to stop me from asking questions. They burst out of my mouth, and I asked so many so quickly, I don't even remember what they were. I figure most of them boiled down to something like, "What's on the other side?" When the old man spoke, it was like his voice carried an epoch of suffering and weariness. I was looking at a soul that had been put through the ringer. Twisted and washed, cleansed, battered, and abused. It wasn't the same soul that had left, that was for sure. But one look in those eyes told you it wasn't lying either. Servitude, he answered, and it was like the ringing of a gong. I almost asked a follow-up question, but good God, something inside me choked and stopped the words. A part of my soul died hearing that word. I still lay awake at night thinking about it. Servitude. I don't even know what it means, but it has haunted me ever since. Now it's just like that picture, something I bury and try to forget about. I don't want to think about it, and nor does your average Joe. If I let myself start to asking questions like who's doing the serving, my mind just doesn't stop. I spent 6 months going in circles, reading old case files hoping to learn more. That word still calls out to me a few times a day, scattering my thoughts like rats before a torchlight. Minimizing the harm done by these kids can be hard when it's at risk of putting you in a rubber room. Like I said, the only thing on our side is that 99% of people just don't want to face the truth of what's underneath all the mundane, boring shit we call daily life. That's why so many of these parents are so deeply unprepared. It takes a kind of twisted mind to imagine the world the way a kid does, and more importantly, to think of all the ways it can go wrong. Your goldfish has gone to live in the sea. The tooth fairy will take your old teeth. Santa punishes the naughty. Parents have been indoctrinated since childhood to think these white lies are a fundamental building block of parenting. It's impossible to break as a habit. Even parents who know better, reasonable, intelligent people who are doing the best they can, will still make a few mistakes here and there. The best they can hope for is that it doesn't backfire and wipe out half the town. That's when the other half of my job comes in. Cleanup. I have to direct the parents to the right type of cleanup crew. Most of the time, it's the guys with mops, buckets, and a very strong stomach. Other times, it's a nasty man in a suit who knows how to stop our neighbor from posting photos to the internet. Fuck. And once it was a bunch of guys in lead-lined hazmat suits. That was a tough one to figure out. We still don't really know what happened, but the Geiger counters they'd left behind still haven't stopped clicking. Talking about tooth fairies, in some parts of the world, they're very real. They weren't always real, you understand, until some of these kids came along. Do you know how fucking scary the idea of a tooth fairy is to the average child? Let's just say what some kid dreamed up in the 80s is exactly what you'd expect from a being who steals teeth for a living. Its face is nothing but a palette of teeth growing all over the damn thing, so that there's barely a sliver of gum wider than a finger. And the teeth stink. They're all rotting and yellow like a meth addict's. And this thing goes around taking teeth, and whenever an old one falls out of its, well, I'll call it a head, but I'm not exactly an anatomist. But anyway, when one falls out, it takes one of the teeth it's collected from kids' mouths and finds a new home for it. Its muscular arms shake as it forces the root through flesh and cartilage, and I swear the sounds it makes are cries, but who knows. I always hoped the damn thing would disappear when the kid grew up, but nope. It's apparently still out there, climbing gutters and drainage pipes, using its arms because the kid who dreamed it with no legs. And that's just one of them. There are lots of tooth fairies. Like I said, the world is terrifying to kids. And they think things in a way we can't easily predict. But the consequences are all too real. Often for the parents, sometimes passers-by, the only saving grace is that most of these kids are well-intentioned, even the difficult ones, the ones with learning difficulties or emotional problems. They'll show regret when they realize that their actions have hurt people. That's the most important ingredient in a person. Remorse. People hurt each other all the time, but the vast majority of us don't do it knowingly. And even if we do know, it's something we figure we have to do. But of course, there are others. Kids and people who know damn well what they're doing. I don't know a whole load about them, just enough to help me identify them in my work. But they're the kids who are ambivalent to the pain they cause because they just don't care. Most of them are narcissists, content to chase dreams of money and sex because it gives them a thrill. You read about how psychopaths do well in certain jobs like investment banker or whatever. Great. Good for them. The gifted ones I work with are actually quite similar. They're not necessarily any worse than the other kids. They just tend not to be bothered when I explain to them that after what they did to their little brother, he won't be able to play any more Xbox with them. There's no guilt, no remorse. The really bad ones, though, they're not just indifferent. They get a kick out of it. It takes a lot of moving parts to come together so that you can make a person who enjoys hurting others. I read once that most serial killers have lower IQs because the average psychopath knows damn well that the cost-benefit analysis of murder isn't in their favor. Murder is hard and the payoff is usually quite small. And a smart psychopath knows that. Society imposes enough consequences to keep most people in line. But when they're gifted, well, those consequences just go right out the window, don't they? If I can demonstrate the presence of sadism and a total absence of remorse and empathy in a child, I can request permission to euthanize them. Some of the first tests we do when finding one, brain scans, questionnaires, EEG, so on, are all about identifying psychopathy. I used to hate it. The kids would ask what we were looking for, or sometimes start bawling their eyes out during the hammer test. My least favorite test of them all. And it always broke my heart to imagine what was waiting for them if I made the wrong decision. I understood logically why we did it. I just hated knowing that I had that kind of power. Those kids didn't know what waited at the end of the road if they failed the tests. Not even their parents knew. I would have given anything to get the agency to drop those tests. And then, I met Bradley. We had 16 teachers suffer kidney failure in a single year, and that's what flagged his hometown for further investigation. Looking at the injuries some of these teachers had suffered, I was convinced that we were dealing with a teenager who had latent abilities. That kind of cruel spite is usually reserved to teenagers, but actually, Bradley was just 7. I first saw him lying in his living room floor, reading a university-level textbook on anatomy. He was something of a prodigy, although he himself admitted he wasn't that smart until he started taking bits of other people's minds. The funny thing was, his father was the spitting image of Bradley. His mother too. But you expect that kind of thing, don't you? What you don't expect is to see that other kids in Bradley's class look a little like him. That parents all over the place had been crying havoc to local scientists who simply don't have any answers. They got these photos of their kids just a few years before Bradley moved in. And they look different. They have different facial structures, different hair color, different eye color. It's subtle at first, but as time goes on, you see those kids change more and more, and it's undeniable who they're changing into. And then the complaints stop because, of course, the parents start to look a little more and more like Bradley too. "I'm just borrowing bits of them," he told me. "Most people don't think enough. There's all this spare room in their head, so I just help them find a good use for it." He infected their minds, and without really knowing why, he made them a little bit more like him. It was a side effect, of course, but a shocking one. We had to cull a lot of people to bring things back to normal, and even then, Bradley wouldn't just let us kill his main source of computing power. We had to negotiate, and what he wanted was, well, he liked vivisection, and he really liked live subjects. He also liked our tools, he said. Some things he just couldn't learn from pilfering the average person's brain, but in our labs, he was like a kid in a candy store. We didn't really think that part through, if I'm honest. Putting him in a room with our scientists was guaranteed to end badly. But Bradley was so powerful. Without ever really noticing, we pivoted from trying to contain him and started trying to just appease him. He was unlike any kid we'd come across. There was nothing stopping him from tying your colon into a knot just to see what would happen. He got a kick out of it, out of seeing other people suffer because of his own actions. We don't let scientists out in the field now, just in case another telepath picks up some useful tips. A burst pancreas here, a brain bleed there, turning your blood to something the consistency of pudding. We still hold annual conferences trying to figure out what Bradley was, what his endgame was. He certainly wasn't interested in any kind of new race or evolution. If we ever implied that he wasn't the only psychic, he'd get very upset. I lost my first supervisor to that. We didn't know what Bradley was at the time. We just found him in his home, sure enough, and he was odd. Definitely intelligent beyond all reason, but we didn't know. "You may feel alone, Bradley," my boss said, "but in fact there are estimated to be nearly 100,000 children just like you." "There's no one like me," the little boy replied, and his eyes fixed on my boss like daggers. Next thing I know, my boss is shaking, convulsing. Blood is foaming out of his mouth, nose, and ears. When they finally got around to doing an autopsy on the old man, they say that there was barely anything left inside his skull. It had been ejected with force out of any available orifice from the neck above. What little of his brain remained was pooled at the base of his skull, like the final dregs of a milkshake at the bottom of a cup. It was Bradley's ego that brought him down. After 2 years of watching him massacre his way through a small town and then our labs, all while wondering when he'd finally set his sights on some bigger prey, I decided I couldn't just let him carry on. The thing about kids is that even ones like Bradley, even the smartest, most clever, and most knowledgeable ones, don't really have any experience. Throw in an ego the size of a planet, and they often lack that essential humility beaten into most of us by adulthood. In the end, it was a little white lie that saved me. Saved us all, really. No one's spoken to what's on the other side, I told him. We never had any gifted person be able to reach out and see what happens after death. He came out of his room the next day and just... I don't know. I didn't feel sorry for him, but shit, I came close. He had a little desk in the middle of our lab's main floor, where he'd watch the scientists and read their minds like most kids flip through TV channels, and he walked right up to it and sat down. He looked so beaten, so utterly wiped out. He asked me for crayons, so I gave them to him, and he spent a few minutes scribbling something. A little house with some trees, and next thing I know, he's gone. He just popped out of thin air like he was deleted from one of life's animation frames. He wasn't dead, he put himself into the drawing. They talk about him like I trapped him, like I beat him. But the truth is, I think Bradley could leave the drawing whenever he wants to. You can see him in that house. He's painting in there, I think. It's all he ever does. Sooner or later, the page will be lost, destroyed. Maybe even intentionally. There's no such thing as infinity when it comes to human life. But I remember the look in that dead old man's eyes, and I remember how it made me feel. Servitude. Bradley must have seen right through into whatever afterlife there is. And he did so with such clarity, it had put all the other kids to shame. Now I think he's hiding. I think he knows sooner or later he's going to end up on the other side, and there's nothing he can do to stop it. All that's left to him is to put as much distance between the beginning of his life and its end. And he knew from experience he could make all kinds of special places where time runs slower than the norm. Don't forget, he had all my memories to go through as well. I have no doubt he knew about that little girl, the infinite beach. Thankfully, we think Bradley was a blip, a cloud computing telepath who borrowed other people's minds to strengthen his own powers. That's the kind of feedback loop that could end the world, maybe even the universe. We're glad he called it quits, although it unsettles me to think of the reason. Someone asked me what I think these kids are. I'm not sure, but I'm tempted to call them a bug, an error. Whatever they are, they've tapped into something underneath the banal reality most of us fixate on. The one filled with recyclable cups and microwave TV dinners. You hear that and you think it must be a thing of wonder to have that kind of knowledge. I just think of Bradley, a literal god amongst humans who took one hard look and fled with his tail between his legs. If I ever glimpse his face in that picture, looking out the window, all I can think is that he looks so goddamn scared. I took a deep breath as I approached the house. I parked my shitty 2010 Mazda hatchback down the block, off Dewey Avenue. I didn't want the patchy paint job and plastic sheet duct tape over the shattered back passenger side window to diminish the curb appeal. It really was a beautiful home. The clean, white siding stood out stark against the deep green of the trees framing it from behind. The smiling face of my new boss, Wendy, who was kind enough to hire me when I moved to Gray Hill a few months back, stared up at me from the for sale sign on the manicured lawn that was several times larger than my apartment. To calm my nerves, I kept running through the details in my head as I approached. Built in 1991, 1 story, 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, 2,800 square feet, entirely renovated within the past year. Every time I walked inside, I was reminded of my initial surprise at the fact that the family had wanted to sell it at all. It had sat vacant for years, and they'd completely renovated, but they had moved back out before they would have even had time to enjoy it. I set the AC to a comfortable temperature, placed finger foods out on the brand new granite countertops, generic music that could best be described as chill playing, and had a candle on the warmer. I'd heard a recent story of a realtor lighting candles throughout a house and forgetting to extinguish them before locking up. I'll just say that synthetic carpet is highly flammable, so it's a good thing that the home had still been covered by the seller's insurance. I'm still new to this, and this was one of my first solo events, but I felt like I was ready. I mean, I had to be. I needed to pay my rent and buy groceries. The month before, I had to choose between one of the two, and that just wasn't going to cut it again. Despite having poured all that money and time into the home, the prior owners insisted on selling it for far less than what it was worth. They'd already packed up and taken everything with them, trying to distance themselves from the process as much as possible. They refused to set foot back inside, opting to instead answer any questions I had over the phone with tense one-word answers. The longest sentence any of them ever spoke to me was an impassioned, "Please, do whatever you can to get rid of it." Despite all of that, I was feeling good, and I had an hour to spare before the open house started and people started streaming in. To pass the time and further calm my nerves, I decided to wander around as another last-minute refresher for any questions I'd get. I walked around, circling through the kitchen and living room, past the stairs. Wait. I stopped so abruptly that I nearly tripped myself. The stairs were not there any of the times I'd been to the house. I was sure of it. But since staircases don't typically appear out of thin air, I thought maybe I was so nervous that I was just losing my damn mind. I decided to check my paperwork to make sure I wasn't conflating it with a different house I'd been to recently. It did confirm that this was a one-story. The long set of worn wooden stairs, they seemed old, as if the owners had ignored them during their renovations, led to a small landing and door. There was no second floor visible from the outside, though. There was just physically no room for it. Despite defying logic, it was clearly there. I hesitantly decided that I might as well check it out in case I got questions about it. The old wooden steps creaked in protest as I climbed. As I walked through the door, it felt like I'd stepped several decades back in time. When I cleared the threshold, I felt a painful pressure in my ears, as if I were on an airplane making steep landing. A musty smell of old, forgotten things permeated throughout. There was a small extra kitchen, another family room, a bathroom, a bedroom, and a locked room with a glass door. A full-length curtain on the other side obscured the interior from my view. I stopped to take it in, and the curtain seemed to flutter, as if there was a slight breeze, or something moving behind it. The bedroom had wallpaper consisting of ornate patterns and black velvet flowers. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but there was no dust or any other signs of age-related wear. A sudden sound from around the corner made me jump. A radio had begun playing in the living room, filling the second floor with a staticky sound, as if stuck between stations. The soft, lime green sofa on shag carpet and TV that looked older than I was made the place feel like it was straight out of the 70s, despite that being a couple of decades before the house was supposedly built. There was another odd curtained room off the living room too. It looked identical to the first, but the door was open. Just a crack. I couldn't figure out why at the time, but that made me nervous. It didn't help that despite it being only 6 p.m. in July, it was pitch black outside the windows up there. I couldn't make out any of the surrounding trees or homes. They appeared to have been swallowed up by the thick night beyond. The cheery colors of the interior suddenly felt like a thin veneer painted over something much, much darker. I decided I'd spent enough time up there, and couldn't help but think, I hope the upstairs disappears again by the time the guests arrive, which was a sentence I never imagined I'd find myself uttering. When I rounded the corner back into the tiny kitchen, the changes made me shiver. Cabinets were open that had been closed, but worse, the door to the stairs was just gone. I felt raw panic creeping in at the sheer wrongness of it. The top floor couldn't have been more than 1,000 square feet, I was fairly confident that there was no way I had just misplaced the exit, but decided to retrace my steps. Maybe I hadn't come in through the kitchen after all? I went back down the hall to the bedroom and bathroom. I couldn't help but notice that the door to the curtained room was gone. I leaned into the bedroom with the fuzzy wallpaper and noticed that the glass door was in there now, open just a bit more. Something about the faint sound coming from behind it made me realize I didn't want to stick around for when it opened all the way. I walked quickly back and stuck my head into the living room. The curtained room that had been there was gone. The door to the stairs I had taken up there had yet to disappear, but a new door had, though, at the back of the kitchen. I debated and eventually decided to open it. To my immense relief, there were stairs. I laughed, glad that I'd just gotten turned around. But the more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't right. It was dark at the bottom, so much so that part of the steps blended into and then disappeared into a blackness as velvety as the old wallpaper. These stairs also looked old, much, much older than the rest of the house appeared to be. Before I realized what I was doing, I had already walked down several steps. I had an inexplicable urge to continue downward. Something was down there that I needed. I'm not sure how, but I could feel it that it was old, ancient maybe. It needed me too. I was there, and it had waited so long. It felt good to be wanted. I felt right, descending into the darkness. Its elation was infectious. It vibrated through the air. No, elation isn't the right word. It was the yearning of something hollow, dangerous, looking to be full. It was needful. I was terrified. I knew something horrible awaited me, and yet I kept continuing towards it against my will. In my mind, fear and self-preservation were fighting a losing battle against whatever it was down there that had its hooks in me, pulling me towards it. The air was electric with its excitement. My foot began to disappear into that horrid, beautiful, foreboding darkness. In the distance, a door opened and closed, shattering the silence. Someone was calling out to me. It was a light in the dark. I blinked and suddenly remembered the open house. In that moment, the connection between the thing in the darkness and myself was broken. I took advantage of the distraction and ran back up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. Someone was downstairs, looking for me. I ran through the kitchenette, and to my relief, the door to lead downstairs had returned. The real stairs. I could have cried in relief, but didn't dare blink or let anything obscure my vision, lest it disappear again. The door to the curtained room had also moved again, right next to the exit. It opened towards the back hall, so that I could have peered inside from where I was standing. It was halfway open, and my instincts told me, do not look in there. Don't look. As I reached for the knob of the door to downstairs, a soft crying permeated the air. It was coming from the curtained room. It was alien, unlike anything I had heard before. It was not a mournful sound. Don't look. My hand tightened around the knob as the cry became louder, closer to the entrance of the partially open door. Closer still. I darted down the stairs, only pausing once I'd reached the bottom to look over my shoulder, only letting out a breath after ensuring nothing had followed me. Someone had shown up early. I must have made a terrible first impression as I came flying down the stairs, sweaty, eyes wide with terror. I tried to get my shit together and think of some way to explain my terrible state. But before I could even begin to figure out what to say, he gestured to my ears. "Are you okay?" I gingerly touched my right ear, and then the other, and sure enough, a small trickle of blood was leaking from each. I hadn't even noticed, but it had been dripping down, staining my collar. I managed to collect myself a bit before the rest of the potential buyers came filing in and let my hair down to hide the bloodstains. The rest of the night was a blur. Honestly, I was on edge, ready to leave and lock myself in my apartment, sleep with all the lights on. I decided I was never going into a dark room again. I could barely focus on the open house. I hoped, more than I'd ever hoped for anything before, that no one would go up the stairs or make me go up there again. Not a single guest approached them, asked me about them, or even looked at them. Instead, they dodged around the staircase like there was an invisible obstacle there. For a while, as I nodded and answered questions robotically, I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. Was I losing my grip on reality? The only thing that confirmed to me that I hadn't had some sort of waking nightmare was when the first guest stopped me on his way out. He told me to take care, that it was going to be okay, and I almost hugged him. I think he saved my life by giving me some sort of anchor to reality. He took one last look at me, and then very clearly stared up at the door at the top of the stairs for quite a while, before disappearing out the front door. After making my rounds through the house, once it seemed like the last straggler had left, I stuck my head outside to verify. There was still one last car in the driveway, meaning someone was still in the house. I could just barely make out faint footsteps. They were coming from above my head, and I called out a cautious, "Hello?" The steps stopped, and never started back up. I darted up the stairs, not daring to enter again, opting instead to peer in from the landing. I don't know how to explain it, but even before I saw that door leading to the thing in the darkness was ajar, I knew I was already too late. I could feel that while I was not alone, I was the only person left in the house. I waited downstairs for hours, hoping I was wrong, hoping they'd made their way back down. When they didn't, I wasn't sure what else to do. I locked up, and I went home. After a few days, the car still hadn't moved. I called the police to report it abandoned. Maybe it was due to my crazed and bloodied appearance, or maybe the visitors could pick up on the general sense of wrongness. But to my immense relief, no offers were made after the first showing. I knew from the moment that I had felt myself inch towards the hungry thing in that deep darkness that I could not let anyone buy that house. The nameless, unaccounted-for visitor that had disappeared into it, well, that just confirmed it. Yesterday, I made a call to the homeowner and asked one final question, one that could be answered with a simple yes or no. I had another open house tonight. I made sure the AC was set to a comfortable temperature, put out the food, and got the music playing before I lit all the candles I'd brought. I placed myself at the bottom of those stairs. Most guests walked past without so much as noticing them. But every so often, someone's eyes would tilt upwards, staring at the entrance to a second floor that did not exist. I didn't move from that spot until I ensured that every single person left that house. After they did, I went room to room, moved one of the lit candles so that the flames licked up against a curtain, nudged a few onto the synthetic carpet. I placed one on the landing at the top of the stairs for good measure. I waited for the roar indicating the spread of the flames before I shut the door and closed the lockbox. As I stared out at the car, which had remained abandoned in the driveway for weeks, I could almost hear the strained voice of the prior owner. "Please, do whatever you can to get rid of it." I know I made the right decision. There was a perfect storm, both literal and metaphorical, of external events that caused it to happen the way it did. But it all started with the planned transfer of one of the most hated men in the state. His name was John Wheatley Jr., and after his most recent spate of convictions, he was sentenced to over 300 years in prison. John's exploits were infamous, and he shared that infamy with his father, John Wheatley Sr. The two-man team terrorized co-eds up and down East Coast colleges over the course of 6 consecutive summers. They'd finally been chased down, but only John Jr. was apprehended. John Sr. miraculously got away, and a statewide search had recovered no clues or hints to his whereabouts or direction. John Sr. was a Vietnam vet who'd been captured and held prisoner for several years before escaping. The man knew how to disappear, and a lot more. John Sr.'s training helped the father-son duo avoid capture for years. They left no evidence at scenes and planned the attacks meticulously. The father and son would check out various campuses and monitor whatever security was there. The campus they liked, the two would stick around and watch girls for days, profiling them and deciding which one or ones would be the easiest prey. When John Sr. picked a target girl, they'd follow her home and observe her comings and goings. If she had roommates, they'd watch them too. Sometimes the roommates would be side victims in the eventual attack. While the target girl was out during the day, John Sr. would use his expertise to break into the house. From there, he and John Jr. would remove the screens and loosen screws on the door handles. They'd unload guns if there were any in the house, and they'd leave pieces of rope around to help with binding the girl's wrists and ankles. The two became really good at it. But they'd eventually been caught. Or at least John Jr. was, and he was being held in a prison in the city during the trial. There was an uproar for him not getting the death penalty, which everyone knew wouldn't happen, but there was still outrage among the dozens of families of survivors. A large prison transport bus with 4 cruisers chaperoning it left the courthouse. Within minutes, the bus was attacked and overwhelmed by the large crowds. But John Jr. wasn't in the transport bus. In fact, there weren't any prisoners on it at all. The bus was a decoy. John Jr. had been snuck out a back door and shoved into the rear seats of an unmarked that I was driving. There was a storm coming in that night, and my second driver called in violently ill, as did the backup driver. Chaos was about to descend on the city, so I was quickly sent out with just John Jr. It would just be him and I for the 2-hour drive to his new home at the state's largest max security prison. We managed to completely avoid any crowds through the city and made it to the outskirts with ease. That was when the rain really started. I was driving 30 on the interstate and saw more transport trailers flipped on the side of the road than I have in my whole life. The interstate became quiet halfway into the drive, and it felt like it really was just John Jr. and I. He must have felt the same way, because that's when he started talking.
So, it's just you and me tonight, huh, buddy? I thought they always needed 2 of yous for these here rides. Been in my experience anyways. Buddy there probably called in sick, huh? And the backup guy too?
I knew he was trying to bait me. Get in my head, maybe even cause an accident. Anything that would prevent me from taking him to where he was going.
You're a tall guy, 6'3".
You know how they get your body in a coffin if you're over 6 feet? They break your legs, shove them up into your abdomen. They say it looks the same. I don't think it does. I caught his eyes briefly in the rear view, but turned away the second I did.
You have a hard time looking people in the eyes, officer. You don't like me. That's fine.
I don't like you either. Stop talking. I wish I hadn't spoken, but it just came out.
I ramble when I'm excited,
he said. Yeah? You excited that your dad left you to get thrown in prison for the rest of your life? Just totally fucking abandon you? His son? What else you excited for? Your new home? At the state pen? Enjoy the next hour of the ride, 'cause nothing's ever gonna get better than this for you. Silence took over the car, and I figured that it'd shut him up. But I was wrong.
I called him, you know?
I decided I wasn't taking any more bait and remained silent.
My dad, with his phone call at sentencing. I told him I forgave him, that I understood, and he told me he was outside of this house in Temple.
Temple's a small town in the outskirts of the city I worked in. I owned a house in Temple with my wife and daughter. The word grabbed me, but I tried to keep a poker face.
In the East End, some sweet little street called Blackburn.
My heart basically stopped at that moment. Guessing Temple was one thing, but guessing Blackburn was a complete shot in the dark.
What do you know about Blackburn? Oh, not much, unfortunately. My daddy does, though. All it took was a couple phone calls, following people around, finding out schedules, routes. He got the list of prison transport drivers, looked into the 3 of yous and decided you were the one that'd drive me. So he made sure the other 2 didn't make it in tonight. I dialed my wife's cell number, but it went straight to voicemail. She ain't gonna answer. I grabbed the radio and was about to call dispatch, but John Jr. cut in. You ever want to see that family of yours again? You are going in the wrong direction if you make a call on that. Put the fucking radio down or your wife and daughter disappear forever.
I put the radio down.
That's right. Now you're gonna keep driving or Dad's gonna do some awful things to Jess and little Tina.
Keep fucking driving. I slammed the brakes and got out of the car. I opened the back door and pressed my gun to John Jr.'s forehead. I yelled for him to call it off, to call his father off, or I'd blow his brains out.
Oh, so my options are get my brains blown out or go to prison for 300 years?
Pull the fucking trigger. I didn't know what to do.
How do I know if I let you go, he'll let them go? You don't. But if you don't let me go, he definitely won't. Now get back in the fucking car. It took everything in me not to blow him away right there. But I closed the back door, got back in the front seat, and resumed the route I was on. After a few minutes of silence, John Jr. finally broke it. You know them girls we fucked? Sometimes we'd call them after. Weeks later, we'd take one of their yearbooks from high school when we were there. So we'd pretend we were an old classmate, bullshit them, chat them up for a bit before bringing up something we did the night we were with them. Something they'd remember. Listen to their voice change when they realized who they were really talking to. What are we doing? Up ahead, there's a set of train tracks. You know the ones. You're gonna cross them and pull over on the other side, and you'll await further instructions. I kept driving, not wanting him to talk any further. You know, I don't think I could ever have a daughter. I think I'd just... Train tracks, up ahead. I could barely see them, but they were there. Cross them, pull to the right. I crossed the tracks and pulled to the right, which was populated by a forest full of shadows. Turn it off, John Jr. said. I turned off the ignition. A second later, a set of brake lights blinked on and off in the forest. Open my door. I got out and opened his door. John Jr. got out and faced me. He smiled with a mouthful of rotten meth teeth and lifted his handcuffed hands to be released. I uncuffed him, hating every second of it. Good night, officer. John Jr. turned away and started toward the getaway car. I yelled out to him to stop, to wait. I asked him where was my family, my wife and daughter. How the fuck should I know? He yelled back, and at that moment, John Sr. burst out of the getaway car with a shotgun and fired at me. It tagged me right in the chest, and thankfully I was wearing my vest. I landed hard. My arm moved on its own, grabbing my gun and firing it off towards the car. I couldn't even see where I was shooting. I just kept pulling the trigger until I heard the magazine go click. When it did, all I could hear was the storm overhead. I looked over at the getaway car and saw two bodies on the ground. John Jr. and John Sr. I'd managed to tag them both at least twice. Then I heard a groan. Only it wasn't from the two men. It was from the getaway car. From inside the trunk, which was lined with bullet holes from my gun. A cough barked out. A wheeze. More coughing. I knew what was in the trunk, but I didn't want to check. Still, I walked over to the getaway car and found the trunk unlocked. I opened it and found out where my wife and daughter had been this whole time. I'll probably be killed, or at the very least, arrested for posting this. I don't care anymore. I just want to get the truth out. Quinny, I'm sorry. It was just after 8 in the morning when we pulled up to the dive bar on the corner.
catering to the third shift South Philly stevedores over at the docks. Quinn sat in the passenger seat, his black leather coat straining to conceal his considerable bulk. He trained his predatory gaze on the bar's front door from under the brim of his gray Jeff cap. "What's the kid's name again?" he asked. "Sal Narducci," I said. Quinn should have known Sal's name already, but the finer details of our operations at the docks always bored him. Among our port guys, Sal was younger than most, but I was glad we made him the overnight shop steward. He proved to be a solid kid, which was why we immediately came out here when he told us he had some concerns. Sal walked out of the bar, breath frosting in the cruel February wind. I waved him over. He got into the car. I reached back and shook his hand. "What's up, buddy?" He nodded to me. "Hey, Frank. Hey, Quinn." Quinn grumbled a hello as he lit a Marlboro. Sal rubbed his frigid hands together and spoke through chattering teeth. "How's your uncle? It's been a while since I last seen him." "He's doing good," I said, although that was a lie. Uncle Mick's health had gone to shit in the past year. He rarely left the house, which meant I handled the day-to-day operations at the docks. "So, we heard you had some issues during your shift last night," I said. I watched him in the rearview mirror, fingers trembling as he struggled to light a cigarette. "You guys know I never make a peep," Sal said. "Your uncle knows that I keep my head down and do my job." "And that's why we're here, bud," I said. "When a guy like you has a concern, we listen. Our uncle listens." "Yeah, so spit it the fuck out already," Quinn said. "We had a ship come in around 3 in the morning. There was a shipment on there. For the Russians, I think." He slipped me a piece of paper with the box's serial number written on it. "What was the problem?" I asked as I pocketed the number. "The box had an air vent, Frank." "They all do," Quinn barked back. "Small vents, yeah," Sal said. "This vent was bigger?" I asked. Sal nodded, his eyes darting this way and that, like he was afraid we were being watched. "Someone rigged it up that way. The manufacturers don't make them that big." He paused and took a long drag from his cigarette. "This vent was big enough so someone inside the box could breathe." I lit a smoke of my own. "It's not what you think." But even as I said that, I shot a sideways glance at Quinn and saw my big cousin's face turn pale. "Our uncle doesn't deal in that kind of business," I assured Sal, and, to a degree, Quinn. Sal wasn't convinced. "Couldn't the Russians just lie to you guys and say it was something else?" "It's probably an animal," I said, giving Sal a reassuring smile. "An animal?" Quinn asked. "Yeah," I said. "Russians like exotic pets. Check it out on YouTube." I looked back at Sal. Poor kid wasn't even 35 yet, but right now he looked like he was pushing 50. "Listen, guys, I know it's against the rules, but if we could just go crack that box open, I'd feel a whole lot better," Sal said. We never opened shipments. The contents weren't our business. We were middlemen. That was all. Various factions around Philly paid us a fee to ferry their wares through the docks with little fanfare. If we started poking our noses where they didn't belong, it could cost us money. Sal Narducci, the stevedore with a conscience. I wondered, if I told him no, we weren't going to crack open that sea box, would he go ahead and do it anyway, on his own? I sighed, then glanced over to Quinn, the way that I did whenever we were in these situations. Quinn cocked an eyebrow as if to say, "Are you sure?" I nodded back to him, quick and subtle. All right, I said. We'll head over there with you right now and get to the bottom of this. Sal smiled at that, tears of relief welling up in his eyes. Thanks, guys. Thank you so fucking much. The Shocks groaned as Quinn rolled out of the passenger seat. Here, switch places with me, Quinn said to Sal. Easier for you to give directions once we're at the docks. Sal nodded, got out, and took the passenger seat. Quinn slumped in behind Sal, making the car rock uneasily, like a ship listing from side to side. You're a solid guy, I told Sal as I pulled onto Washington Avenue. In the back seat, Quinn discreetly doused a rag with chloroform, then clamped it tight around Sal's mouth. Sal bucked and kicked like an animal caught in a snare, but Quinn held him firm. Within seconds, Sal slumped in his seat, unconscious. Quinn donned 2 white latex gloves and pulled out a small pill bottle from his coat. Inside were a half-dozen counterfeit Percocets. Each one contained a lethal dose of fentanyl. As I turned onto I-95 North, Quinn pulled open Sal's slackened jaw, then pushed the pill down his throat. We were looping through the claustrophobic West Kensington side streets as we waited for Sal to stop breathing. The kid's eyes fluttered, flashing his milky, bloodshot eyes like scoops of vanilla ice cream, topped with raspberry syrup. Quinn reached up from the back seat. He checked Sal's pulse against his wristwatch as the seconds ticked away. Shouldn't be too much longer, Quinn said. He leaned back into his seat. So, what do you think? About what? About the sea box with the big air vent. Probably an animal. Or something organic that needs a certain amount of oxygen. Like what? Quinn asked. I don't know. Fucking plants or some shit. Yeah, I guess. Maybe. Sal's chest heaved. I noticed a ring of vomit around his mouth. His breaths, already labored, were now accompanied by a gurgling, liquid sound. I rolled to a stop by an alley between 2 derelict houses. Up the alley, I spotted the rats, dark shapes scrabbling in the shadows. Next to me, Sal let out one final gurgling respiration before his body went still. We dumped Sal Narducci's body in the alley. One more overdose in a neighborhood full of them. As we got back into the car, my beeper went off. A signal from Uncle Mick. I looked at the message. A single digit. The number 9. Quinn must have known from my expression. Claremont again? I nodded as we pulled away. Claremont again. Uncle Mick lived in a 2-story row home in Fishtown. He'd always lived alone, except for when he took in me and Quinn. Our parents checked out together in a car wreck back in '98. On the couch, he looked like a grizzly sitting upright, beer in hand, a Marlboro tucked into the corner of his mouth. He exhaled the cigarette smoke through his nostrils, the color of a ripe plum. Uncle Mick hacked phlegm into a fist the size of a misshapen softball. How'd it go with the kid? Quinn lowered his head and made for the kitchen. Not well, I told my uncle. He found a sea box with an air vent. Uncle Mick fired back a slug from his Budweiser, golden restorative sloshing in the bottle. They all have air vents. He said it was a big air vent. And? We'll need a new overnight shop steward. Out in the kitchen, we heard ice clinking into glasses, then the whine of the liquor cabinet hinges as Quinn searched for the Bushmills. Uncle Mick leaned forward and lowered his voice. Was the kid right to be worried? He was worried over nothing, I answered. He narrowed his bloodshot gaze, as if he were studying me. "Them young Chinese girls and the wishy-washies don't grow on trees, Frankie," he said quietly. "I don't want no part of that." I made sure to look him squarely in the eye. "We don't have any part of that, Uncle Mick." Quinn returned with 3 tumblers, whiskey on the rocks. He passed one to me and another to Uncle Mick. Quinn slumped his shoulders as he stared into his glass, clinking ice cubes bubbling in the amber contents. Uncle Mick squeezed Quinn's hand. "You're a soldier, Quinny, just like me." Quinn forced a grin. "Thanks, Uncle Mick." Uncle Mick raised his glass. "Slanche," he said. "Slanche," we repeated. We all took a drink. Uncle Mick downed his tumbler in one gulp, then rested the glass on his rounded belly. "Reggie wants to meet tomorrow. King of Prussia Mall, 2 o'clock sharp." "He give any details?" Quinn asked, though Reggie Claremont rarely did. "Nah," Uncle Mick said. He looked away from us then, his eyes dripping melancholy. "And hey, tomorrow, you 2 go on your own." Quinn looked at me, concerned. I shrugged. "Just us?" I asked. Uncle Mick hacked mucus into his fist, then glanced over to the set of portable oxygen tanks he was supposed to use, but hardly ever did. "It's been a while since the last time we saw him, and I don't want him to see me like... you know." I threw back the rest of my whiskey and patted the old bear on his shoulder. "Don't sweat it, Uncle Mick. Me and Quinny got you covered." Claremont and Uncle Mick had been SEALs during the Cold War. They met in Nicaragua, Uncle Mick told us, where they trained Contras and ran black ops against the Sandinistas. "We became real good buddies, me and Reggie," Uncle Mick had once said. "But we went our separate ways after our deployment was over." Saying they went on deviating paths would be a bit of an understatement. While Uncle Mick was busy taking over the river wards, Claremont became a dedicated federal. They didn't speak for a long time, not until about 10 years ago, when Claremont reached out to Uncle Mick for a favor. Claremont headed a subdivision of the FBI that few people knew about. It didn't even have a name. This subdivision investigated odd cases, as Claremont put it. Cases that, I assumed, the intelligence brass would prefer keeping tucked away in an iron vault in the bowels of 935 Pennsylvania Avenue. Claremont had been in the market for subcontractors to carry out off-the-books operations. "I need guys who are dependable, who can work independently, and most importantly, will keep a very level head in strange situations," he'd told Uncle Mick. In return, Claremont offered to pull some strings that would ensure Uncle Mick got control of the Philly Longshoremen's Union, which would effectively crown him king of the docks. Claremont's jobs, although heavy on legwork, were usually straight-up hits with a strange caveat thrown in. He once sent us to track down some voodoo shaman who lived in a Louisiana swamp. All we had to do was slit his throat with a crucifix shaved down to a dagger. Fucker didn't even fight back, just sat there whispering a prayer in Creole while blood fanned out, as his face dried and cracked, mottled skin vacuum sealed to his skull as his eyes leaked out of his sockets, yolk spilling from a cracked egg. Last year, he dispatched us to this frozen armpit of a town 2 hours outside Denver to take care of an elderly antique dealer. The job was straightforward enough, until Quinn popped the guy twice in the noggin. Instead of a familiar pink mist, boiling black pus leaked from the cavern in the guy's head and sizzled right through the floorboards. Easy peasy, sure, but sometimes Quinn got weird afterward. That wasn't to say my big cousin didn't perform as admirably as always, but now and again, he'd get real quiet after a Claremont job. "Frank, you ever think about what comes next? After we die?" He'd asked me after we finished a job down in Florida. I didn't, and up until then, neither had Quinn. He'd been a stalwart non-believer despite our Catholic upbringing. As for me, I gave up the pretense of belief during high school, shortly after a priest cornered me in a bathroom and tried to give me a blowjob. "Some of this shit we do for Claremont makes me think about it," Quinn said. "I only think about the job, Quinny." We parked in the King of Prussia Mall parking garage, 3rd floor, just out of view from the security cameras, per Claremont's instructions. Reginald Claremont was 6.5 feet of muscle carved from volcanic rock. Hulking as he was, his cold baritone voice, detached demeanor, and thick glasses gave him the air of a warrior intellectual. In the decade that I'd known him, he hadn't aged a day. However, as he slipped into the back seat, I saw that he had dark bags under his eyes, as if he hadn't been sleeping. He sank into the seat like he had weights on his ankles. This concerned me. Claremont had been peeling the back layers of reality to peer at the dark things wiggling beneath for years with nothing less than cold objectivity. Perhaps the job was starting to get to him. Or maybe it was just this current assignment that had him rattled. "Where's your uncle?" he asked, his voice tinged with disappointment. "He hasn't been feeling well," I said. Claremont smiled sadly. "Cigarettes?" I nodded. "I told him those Marlboros would do him in," Claremont said. "Myself, I kicked the habit after our last deployment." "I heard somewhere that only 1/3 of smokers die of smoking-related illness," Quinn said as he lit one up. "Still ain't good odds, though." "No, I guess not," Claremont said. He paused contemplatively, watching the smoke from Quinn's cigarette curl and dance. "Actually, let me bum one of those." Quinn gave him one. Claremont lit up, relishing the smoke. A nicotine catharsis. "So what do you got for us?" I asked. "This assignment might be a tad bit hairier than usual," Claremont said. "The good news is that it's close. Up in coal country, in the woods. It's isolated too, so you won't have to deal with any prying eyes." "Who's the target?" I asked. "There'll be 3 soft targets," Claremont began. "But we're mainly concerned with an extraction. His name is Colton Shelby, a Catholic priest with a background in engineering." I hadn't anticipated that we'd be taking anyone alive. Claremont's jobs were always of the pop 'em and drop 'em variety. He never asked us to nab anyone before. By Quinn's expression, I could tell he had the same reservations. "Is he dangerous?" I asked. "On a normal day, no," Claremont explained. "But within the next 48 hours, Shelby is going to run an experiment on himself inside a cabin he's constructed out in the woods. When you get to him, he may be in a strange state. I can wrangle a motherfucker no problem," Quinn said. "But can we get a bit more to go on than that?" "Unfortunately not, because I genuinely don't know," Claremont said. "Shelby studied sacred geometry at the Vatican. He found a text that some long ago pontiff deemed off limits. Long story short, Shelby thinks he's figured out God's name." "What, fucking Yahweh or whatever?" Quinn asked. "No," Claremont said. "Some have speculated that God's true name can only be conveyed through certain geometric patterns.
Shelby believes that if he spells God's name backwards, he'll gain access to heaven. Claremont never gave background info on a target unless it was concrete. I pictured Claremont watching through reinforced tempered glass as men in white coats constructed those very same geometric patterns in the labyrinthine depths of some government black site. Ice filled my bowels. Pray tell, my good agent Claremont, what happened to those unlucky schmucks when they fucked around with the Almighty's birth name? But I couldn't let my imagination get to me. I lit a smoke, inhaled long and deep, and reminded myself that this was what we had to deal with to keep the docks. Claremont passed us a surveillance photo of Shelby. He certainly looked the part. Pensive eyes beaming with intensity, sunken cheeks, and a long, graying Rasputin beard that completed the mad acolyte aesthetic. "You won't be going in blind," Claremont said. "Shelby's 3 male followers are all true believers. But there'll be a 4th, a female. She's one of my sources." "An agent?" I asked. Claremont shook his head. "No." "So, another subcontractor just like us." "Her name's Kendra," Claremont said. "She's Shelby's newest recruit." He gave us the girl's picture. She was pretty, but young, with dark hair and a mouse-like face. Something about her seemed familiar. It was her eyes, I realized. They had the same haunted quality that Quinn got after one of Claremont's jobs. Quinn snatched the girl's picture, looked her over, then glared back at Claremont. This gave me a jump. I looked down to Quinn's waist to make sure he wasn't reaching for his .38. "How old is the girl?" Quinn asked. Claremont cleared his throat. He stared right back into Quinn's fiery gaze, eye to eye, with neither yielding an inch. 20 years old, Claremont finally said. Quinn narrowed his eyes. "How'd your outfit rope a girl that young into a job like this?" "That's not pertinent information," Claremont said. "Yeah, it doesn't matter, Quinny." Quinn didn't break eye contact with Claremont. "I can understand you using guys like us," Quinn said. "But a girl that barely looks a day out of high school?" Claremont sat up a little straighter. I noted that he was slowly curling his hands into fists. "So, how's the port business, boys?" Claremont said. Through his steely gaze betrayed his casual tone. "I was reading in the news that one of the shop's stewards overdosed. A young guy with no history of drug abuse, if I'm not mistaken." I squeezed Quinn's shoulder. "It's been rough," I told Claremont. "We're getting through it, though." Finally, Quinn turned away from Claremont. I exhaled. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath. Claremont opened a folder and passed it to me. "Here's a map of the area. Get there early and take this exact position overlooking the cabin." He tapped his finger on a large red X on the map. It looked to be around 100 yards from the cabin. "When should we make our grand entrance?" I asked. "You'll see a bright light inside the cabin. I mean, bright. That's why it's important you keep your distance." I thought about those unlucky guys in the white coats again. "When the light fades, wait a full minute before approaching the cabin. When you're inside, things will be strange." I laughed, though I didn't think anything was funny. "This won't be the first haunted house you sent us to. This will be different. You may be disoriented initially, but just stay calm. Shelby will be in the middle of the room. There, things will appear closer to normal." Quinn looked back over his shoulder, locking eyes with Claremont once again. "And how do you know that?" Claremont took a long drag from his cigarette, then shook his head without saying a word. I guess that ain't pertinent either, Quinn said. Claremont passed me a burner phone. There's one number programmed onto this phone. When you have Shelby, dial that number and the cavalry will arrive. I took the phone and nodded to him. Sounds simple enough. Tell your uncle I said hello. Claremont opened the door and got out. In the side mirror, I watched him walk off, cigarette smoke trailing behind him. Guided by Claremont's map, we ditched our car along the eastern slopes and began our long, miserable walk into the grim coal country hills. The temperature crept above the freezing mark, and a light rain thawed the soil, turning it into a brown soup. Quinn was quieter than usual, hardly saying a word since we departed from Philly. Though he didn't say it, I could tell he was still hung up on Claremont's girl, Kendra. It was almost dark by the time we found the cabin in a small clearing nestled in among the barren trees. Me and Quinn took position on the western hillside, roughly a football field away, hidden by skeletal tree branches and gnarled bramble. Looking through my binoculars, I saw that the cabin was definitely a rush job, just plywood and drywall from the look of it, although it did look sturdy. There was a mud-splattered pickup truck with a trailer hooked on the tow hitch. I figured that was how Shelby's merry little band got their building materials out there. Though we spotted no movement outside, Shelby and his gang were still hard at work inside the cabin. We could hear the persistently banging hammers and the occasional snarl from a circular saw. "I'm dying for a cigarette," Quinn grumbled. "Yeah, me too," I said. "We couldn't light up out here since it would risk giving away our position. We'd have to make do with nicotine gum." I passed a piece to Quinn. "How are you holding up?" I asked. He chewed the gum thoughtfully. "I think I might need some time off, Frankie," he said. "Good. Very good." I preferred that Quinn recognized that the work was getting to him, rather than being in denial about it. "Yeah, buddy," I said. "When we get back, take off all the time that you need." He nodded. "A few weeks would do me good." Down in the cabin, the hammers fell silent. I pulled out my stopwatch, thumb on the switch, staring at the cabin, waiting. A moment later, we heard the girl scream, piercing and terrible, cleaving through the silence like a machete through a limb. Quinn shot up, clenching his .38. "The girl!" I grabbed for him, tried to pull him back, but he took off down the darkened hill, running toward the cabin. "Quinn, wait!" I hissed at him, but it did no good. That was when the flash came, painfully brilliant, a blinding golden glare that shone through the cracks within the cabin's structure before it illuminated the entire hillside, searing my eyes. My field of vision burned with white fire, a thermonuclear snapshot. It only lasted a moment before it flickered down to a dull glow within the cabin. My vision began to clear. Quinn had made it halfway toward the cabin before the flash knocked him on his ass. He struggled to his feet and began staggering the rest of the way. "God damn it," I said to myself, then hit the stopwatch and waited, one eternal second at a time, as Quinn threw open the cabin door and barreled inside. The stopwatch hit the 60-second mark, and I took off, racing through the thawed muck toward the dying golden light shining through the cabin's cracks. I reached for the door, raised my .38 revolver, and stepped inside. I stumbled forward, into a disjointed panorama of the universe. The world became a shattered rainbow mirror, with each broken shard reflecting a different aspect of space-time. I floated in the amniotic waters within my mother's womb,
then squinted and saw my cells divide, then multiply, then wither and die. I marveled at the untold histories etched into my being, and then followed my lineage back to a trilobite drifting in the primordial stew. Behind me, the very nature of reality shook and sundered as the singularity gave birth to the cosmos. Ahead of me, I watched as the last stars winked out, casting eternal darkness upon a cold, barren universe. In one ear, I listened to a Cherokee warrior's final death rattle, his body riddled with musket balls. In the other, I heard an entire civilization's collective scream moments before the firmament split and the sky blazed with celestial hellfire. I huddled with a dozen young women crammed behind a false wall inside a sea box, sweltering, breathing in the toxic stench from the tin buckets overflowing with urine and shit. I felt the malignant lumps growing in my uncle's chest, unthinking yet ravenously hungry, spreading their greedy tendrils throughout his lungs. I glimpsed heaven on the day of creation as God first revealed himself. Angels dropped to their knees in terror, and his dreadful shadow fell upon the kingdom. As I tried to comprehend his unknowable shape, my primitive brain shrank into itself, a turtle retreating into its shell. Yet, as my mind retreated, a single thought trickled out, like the last drop of water dripping from a rusted sewer pipe. Quinny. I need to get to Quinny. Yes, then I remembered. I shut my eyes and felt the wooden floorboards beneath my boots. I took one step forward, then another. The cosmic violence screaming around me faded slowly with each step, until at last I heard the sound of creaking lumber and caught the aroma of burned meat. It was like stepping into the eye of a hurricane. The prismatic chaos shimmered around us, undulating around a cylindrical shaft of blood-red light. On the floor lay 4 charred cadavers, all but unrecognizable, although only their flesh had been burned. Oddly, their clothes hadn't been affected. Quinn stood over the corpses, but his attention was trained on the awful, writhing mass of pale flesh chained upon a crude stone altar in the center of the floor. "Quinny?" My cousin turned to me. His face was blackened and cracked. His left eyelid was mostly missing, and the flesh had been burned off his right hand, all the way down to the bone. "It's her, Frank," Quinn said. He nodded to the altar. Looking down at those burnt cadavers, I noticed that one of them wore a black cassock with a white collar. Apparently, when the moment of truth came, Colton Shelby had gotten cold feet about touching divinity. I stepped up next to Quinn and beheld the monstrosity, chains clinking as the girl tugged at her bonds. She moaned, softly and anguished. She opened her ruined maw to speak, but only distant rasps came out. Kendra's eyes lolled about listlessly, and when she looked at me, her ragged maw curved into a frown as tears trickled down her cheeks. Quinn cocked the hammer of his .38. "We can't leave her like this," he said. "We're not. Claremont will help her." "Claremont?" Quinn said. His voice wheezed as he spoke, as if his airway had been charred along with the rest of him. "Claremont won't help her. He'll put her in a box so they can cut her open and see what makes her tick." "Quinny, listen to me. You need to remember why we're here. Remember Uncle Mick. Remember the docks." Quinn smiled, his charred lips cracking and oozing pus. "I do remember," he said. "That's why I'm not letting anyone put another girl in a box." Quinn raised his revolver and aimed at the girl.
"I'll take care of you, honey,"
he said. And he would have, if I hadn't pulled the trigger first. My big cousin fell to the floor, still twitching, and I put 2 more in him just to make sure he didn't suffer. Then the prism faded, and the shaft of red light along with it. I made the call to Claremont's people, then sat there in the dark, listening to Kendra's hopeless whimpers. Within 15 minutes, soldiers in black masks arrived. They shackled the girl to a stretcher, then spirited her out into the night. By the time I got to the docks, a light snow was peppering the city, and the icy wind bit right into my bones. Even at 3 in the morning, the docks were alive with forklifts belching propane fumes, roaring diesel big rigs, and the cranes chugging hydraulics out behind the stacks. The office was perched high above the stacks. I was more than a little drunk, and the overnight foreman was more than a little nervous when I demanded he take me up into the warehouse's shipping and receiving office. I didn't blame him. The rank and file were all still whispering about Sal Narducci, no doubt. The nervous foreman was at the computer looking up the location of the C-box Sal had told me about. As the foreman worked, I leaned against the window, gazing out over the docks. I threw back another slug of whiskey. Once I had the box loaded onto a truck, I'd drop it off beneath the I-95 overpass down in Fishtown. Then I'd free the cargo and be fucking done with it. Behind me, the foreman looked up from over the monitor, sweat beading across his hairline.
There's a problem,"
he said.
"What?"
He swallowed hard. His voice shook.
That box got sent out this afternoon. If you want, I can pull up the destination."
"Don't bother," I said. By now, the cargo was likely dispersed among the countless massage parlors and speakeasy brothels around the city. I took another long drink and shut my eyes, but I couldn't shake the image of the disfigured girl shackled to that stretcher. I wondered where Claremont had her by now, if they'd descended upon her with scalpels and pincers yet. I drove my fist into the window glass, shattering it along with my knuckles. The broken shards clinked against the concrete 100 feet below like distant wind chimes. I looked out over the docks as my broken fist wept blood. At the gantry cranes unloading a newly arrived ship, like predators picking at a carcass. Let's get the obvious out of the way. Being a PI sucks. It's not what you think. It's pretty much harassing women. Men hire PIs to go harass their wives and girlfriends, and once in a blue moon, you get asked to find a missing dog, or to harass a man instead. But that's it, really. Sometimes I'm looking for hard evidence of infidelity, but a lot of the time, my clients just want to rattle the soon-to-be ex, to make them paranoid and jittery and less reliable in the courtroom, or less likely to pay attention to small print agreements that stiff them out of the holiday home. So, that's my job. I'm a pawn, and it is almost always on behalf of the kind of men who think women reading a book in public are secretly looking for male attention. I don't have an office. I did for a short while, but things are tough, as I'm sure many of you know, and PI work isn't exactly lucrative. I don't know why I'm still doing this job, except to say I'm my own boss. I went into this with vastly different expectations. If anyone wants to hire someone who was convicted of insurance fraud while training to be a police officer, let me know. Otherwise, I'm on my own, following people in cars and sleeping in dingy motels. So when someone reached out looking for a guy to stalk them, I just figured it was a fetish thing. I got a nephew who went to art school, makes big bucks painting cartoon characters doing fucked up stuff. He isn't painting the Sistine Chapel, but he pays the bills and looks after his family. I figure if that work is good enough for him, this would be good enough for me. So I met the woman and was surprised at how normal she looked. It was in a public place, a park with a nice bench, and even though it was starting to rain a little, we didn't let it bother either of us. We sat there, 2 tape recorders running, and hashed it out. She said she liked me. If she hadn't, she wouldn't have gotten out of her car. It was flattering coming from her. Good-looking woman. Professional. I didn't know at the time, but I'd quickly figure out she was a forensic accountant. Anyway, we got to talking. She never gave me her motivation, but I would later come to understand her as an amateur narcissist. She was new at loving herself. She was smart, accomplished, and actually rather beautiful, provided you didn't spend a great deal of time agonizing over things like symmetry or eyebrows, and instead paid attention to how a smile reaches the eyes, or how laughter sounds when it catches someone by surprise. But she grew up dirt poor, and spent her teen years unable to visit the dentist, or access a gym, or even just eat home-cooked food that wasn't microwaved. Plump frame, blotchy skin. Hair she kept short with a pair of scissors, because her and her mother relied on the shampoo and soap they stole from the motel where they shared cleaning shifts. When she fumbled awkward questions at some of the better-looking boys in her class, she rarely met with success. That's not to say she was an outcast either. It's just poor kids have to grow up early. Prom is a luxury. Eating isn't. If you know, you know. Otherwise, you might be surprised by just how fucking tough it can be for some kids in this country. Anyway, she got out of that hole, fought tooth and nail, got an education, a good job, and by the time she finished her victory lap and took stock of her life, she was 35 years old and 1,000 miles from the trailer she was raised in. And she looked good. The woman in the mirror was a stranger that she wanted to get to know. I think hiring me was an act of self-love. I think if she could have, she would have sat in a car and watched herself get a cup of coffee, spying closely at the professional-looking woman doing a little half-run, half-skip to get out of the rain. The way she stood in line rocking back and forth on her heels to the music in her AirPods, thinking no one would notice. She wanted to admire herself, but unable to time travel or clone herself, she instead resorted to hiring me as a kind of proxy. I had my own boundaries, of course. They covered anything that was going to get me in trouble. The gist of the contract, after a nice week spent meeting after work and talking, was that I was to follow her as often as I could and just observe her. Photos, videos, secret recordings, occasionally a little bit more. Nothing physical. For example, one time I inventoried her handbag after she left it in a taxi by accident. I'm not a photographer, but something about all those knickknacks laid out on a motel bed snapped with a black and white Polaroid. It looked good. Like something you'd see in a fancy gallery. Avant-garde, my nephew would say. She loved it, paid me a bonus for it and everything. Anyway, this carried on like this for about 6 months. They were interesting times. Tailing her across train stations, racing across open parking lots to install a tracker on her car, standing on a bridge and dropping an AirTag in her bag as she walked past. It was a little bit like being a spy. She even paid for me to buy high-end equipment. Crazy stuff. One camera, I could sit on my balcony and read the texts on her phone from a block away. Occasionally, there were days where I couldn't or wouldn't keep up the required intensity. Stalking requires a lot of cardio. When that happened, when I didn't feel like following her into a crowded place or sprinting halfway around town following her car, I'd do research. I'd investigate who this woman had once been. I created fake Facebook profiles and tracked down old school friends, spoke to former teachers, lovers, all of that. The whole job was a matter of mapping her out, like she was a country, you know? And a country isn't just hills, rivers, and borders. Countries have history. She was happy with my initiative. The text she sent me when I showed her the research folder was a glowing commendation. First one I'd had in a long time. It was nice. Someone telling me, good job. She had a real way of making me feel like a kid getting a gold star. I didn't realize at the time, but I was putty in her hands. Head over heels, bless my stupid heart. Of course, I didn't know what I was getting into, but I'd had just enough time to grow overconfident. I made the mistake of thinking that I wasn't going to find anything in her past that'd give me trouble sleeping. Boy, did I get that one fucking wrong. Her mother, that's where things took an odd turn. Now, I knew from news reports the mother died in their trailer while her daughter was off staying at some boyfriend's place for a few days. Natural causes, it read. I wanted to know a little more about what natural causes they were. Figured if there was a congenital thing, it seemed like maybe I ought to know. You'd think the way the trailer park owner reacted to me asking about it, I'd tried asking the Russian government for proof of a democratic election. A thin, reedy little woman who gave me hell the moment I mentioned a name. What do you want to know that for? Who's asking? Who's paying you? Why do you want to dig this shit up? Oh, she ripped me to pieces. I put it down to the natural sprinkling of crazies in the standard population and took a different tact. Started calling up the older folks in the park, residents. Every single one of them hung up on me the second I mentioned her name. Well, all of them except one. Some people want to talk, and this old bastard was one of them. He had a lot to say about everything from the presidents to social media, and I let him ramble on before starting to press my point. Told him at the start I was a historian looking into the local area. That made it so it wasn't too suspicious when I began asking about this and that. Slowly making my way to the death of a 53-year-old woman a couple trailers down from him some years ago. Again, as soon as I mentioned her name, there was a change in the air, even over the phone. For a second, I thought he was going to hang up just like the others. Could hear him smacking his dry lips as he mulled it over.
Francine didn't deserve what happened to her, he said after a while. She wasn't a good woman. Didn't treat her daughter too good neither. But didn't deserve what happened. Maybe if they'd found her earlier, some of those fellas in white coats could have gotten more evidence. But that little wretch of hers away. But from what I understand, weren't much left of her at all.
Then he hung up, leaving me with a whole lot of questions. This, well, it frustrated me. I had, until now, had a fair bit of luck at this new profession of mine. They say be careful what you get good at. Sad truth was, I was getting good at stalking, and this was my first real roadblock. I remembered the way I felt when she told me good job, and it bothered me I couldn't really say much about this critical part of her life. That, and, well, maybe I still got a chip on my shoulder about being a failed policeman. If you give me a problem, I can sometimes drive myself crazy looking for a fix. So, I hopped in my car and drove to the trailer park, damn near on the other side of the country. Don't know what I was hoping to find. No way the trailer was still there, and it wasn't. But what I found odd was the lot hadn't been replaced. There was a hole in the ground, about the right size and nothing else. Just an empty spot where the trailer had once stood. And the trailers on either side weren't occupied either. I could tell by politely and legally looking through the windows. Most of them were cleared out, but a few weren't. They still had plates and other knickknacks left hanging around, like the owners had left without bothering to pack.
You shouldn't hang around there, mister.
The girl who appeared stood a good 20 feet away, shouting over the wind so as to be heard.
Smell can make you awful sick.
I wrinkled my nose, aware of the odor she was talking about. Had been since I approached the empty lot. A faint musty smell that made me think of an exotic pet shop.
What do you mean? Smell makes you sick,
she said like it was self-explanatory.
Woman who died there left behind an awful smell. Made the neighbors sick, and the neighbors' neighbors, and so on for a couple trailers in a row. No one likes to live there now. Still can't. Had a couple move in a year or two back and they got sick too. Daddy says it's a bad one. Not even rats go near that hole.
The smell wasn't pretty, but this trailer park looked like the kind of place where hubcaps went missing regularly. Figured they would have been used to bad smells. What made this one so special? I looked over at the girl. Where is your dad? A few minutes later, and I was stood outside a trailer waiting pensively. The little girl had disappeared inside to fetch her father, and since then, I'd been sat listening to the quietest trailer park in the whole world. Crickets and silence, traffic on a distant highway. Place was dying. That much was clear. When the father finally did make an appearance, he said nothing for the first few minutes, lit a cigarette, offered me one. I refused on account of having quit some time back. After a while, he spoke up. I'd invite you in, but if you've been hanging around that old lot, not sure I want you inside my home. No offense. None taken, I replied. Sally says you're a historian. The man wasn't terribly old, mid-30s at a guess, but he looked me up and down like I was a teenager caught throwing eggs at his house. What are you really? PI, I replied. Huh, now that makes sense. Some relative looking for answers? Heard the Hendersons had a sister with money. That's exactly it, I lied. She didn't buy the official story. Nor should she, he replied. Henderson was fit as a fiddle day he moved in. Weren't no justice in what happened to those who got sick. And poor Francine. They say she died of natural causes. Man, even back when I knew it was shit and I was just a little kid. The smell alone. Think it's bad now, but at the time, before they came in with a crane to lift the trailer up whole and move it to the dump, shit was something awful. There was talk of moving the whole park. Of course, no one gave enough of a shit about us to go ahead and actually do it. What did she die of? Don't know. Only thing I'm sure of is that girl of Francine's lied. Said her mother was live and well when she left before the weekend, and they all was on good terms. But that was bullshit. We heard them fighting for weeks before, for one. And of course, the body stated it was in.
Ain't no way it had been rotting for just a few days.
He offered me another cigarette. I refused. He lit it up instead. Second one in what felt like just a few minutes. Made me itchy just to see. I wanted to say something, anything to get a little bit more. But I'd told a big lie pretending to be there on someone else's behalf, and didn't want to catch myself out. So I just sat and listened to the quiet buzz of his little patio light. After the second cigarette was done, he reached into his back pocket and took out an old photo.
I hope you find justice for Henderson and the rest of them, he said. Only real bit of proof I ever had something fishy went on.
He handed me the picture. It wasn't easy to see what I was looking at. Pile of old leaves, maybe? Mulch? I squinted at it for a few good seconds, but couldn't make heads or tails of it. What?
Took that the day they arrived to get rid of the trailer. Had to stand on my friend's shoulders just to reach.
What is it? I asked, my skin starting to crawl as I picked out details. Whatever I was looking at, it was slumped on a sofa with floral wallpaper in the background. It was about the size of a man, but riddled with holes and cavities the size of golf balls. In my whole life, I had never seen something that looked like that.
Why, that's Francine, he said. Or at least what was left of her.
He let me keep the photo. At a guess, that was the only interesting thing that had ever happened to that man, and he'd been waiting to share it with someone. All I had to do was give him an excuse. He seemed to take some pleasure in passing it on. Certainly found my reaction to it amusing. I must have gone pale as I grappled with thoughts of what had happened to make a body go bad like that. Back in the hotel, under a good light, I checked that picture again and again. Something about it made me deeply uncomfortable. Knowing a woman was under all that. All those holes and crevices must have been made in her flesh. And what had happened to her skin that turned it such a funny texture? Looked furry. Like the kind of thing that grows on top of a long-forgotten cup of coffee. A part of me considered asking my client about this, but I knew that wasn't the way to go. First, she probably would tell me, "Good job," if I had to ask. She hired me to do a certain thing, and that didn't involve politely requesting information right from the source. Second, well, I'd read the police reports, what was publicly available anyway, and she'd made it clear she'd left on the Friday and came home on the Monday, and what if that guy was right? Did she really leave her mother alive and well? I mean, people kill, not just psychos. People like you and me. It happens every day, and sometimes we even pull it off. Only half of US murders get solved. That's a fact. If anyone could be in the right half of that equation, it'd be her. She was smart as hell, my client. Even at 17, she would have been a clever one. Clever enough that she might easily have been able to cover her tracks. Gone over to some boyfriend, twisted his arm into giving her an alibi. Sure, I could see that. I just needed to figure out what the fuck was going on with that crime scene in the trailer. Thankfully, I got some friends still on the force, one of which I even have a bit of leverage on. At first, he couldn't find much on the actual mother, but then I asked him to see if he could take the photo I had, show it around, and see if anyone had seen something like it before. That proved a lot more fruitful. A few days later, he came back with a strange one. But straight away, I saw the connection. I'll spare the details. Old man was found in a tub, all sorts of fucked up, in some old apartment building. It had since been condemned on account of the body, which is fairly weird since bodies don't usually cause that much fuss. But less weird when you realize that said body was in such a bad state, it made 3 people sick and caused long-lasting structural damage. Whatever happened to this guy, it ate through the tub he'd been lying in and seeped into the floors and walls below, turned plasterboard into shit, and apparently even caused some trouble for the sturdier elements like steel and concrete. I don't know how that works exactly, but that's what the file said, and going by the photos, I didn't feel like anyone was lying. As for the pictures, what can I say? Made my fucking skin crawl. No blurry little Polaroid snapped by a kid. These were professional crime scene pictures that showed something in a bathtub that didn't register as human until my eyes went looking for details. He looked like a hairy paper wasp's nest, only there were fingers and nipples and other little things that made it clear it had been built using a person as the framework. No face though, just a head like a pile of used paper plates. Looking at these photos made me learn a new word just to describe how I felt. Trypophobia. Wasn't just the one guy either. Building was linked to the disappearance of the ground floor tenant. Some computer geek. I didn't worry about him too much, but what did catch my eye was there was only one woman living in the whole place. Second floor apartment. The registered name was somewhat familiar, close enough to a certain someone's that it raised the hairs on my neck. Police at the scene managed to get a photo of her, and sure enough, there she was. My client going by a different name. Clearly something fishy was going on, or else why the pseudonym? I figured it possible she'd maybe offed her own mother. Parents and spouses make the most common victims. But what connection was there to that second corpse? And what about the missing guy? It was like a horror movie was following her around, and she was just blissfully unaware. Condemned buildings and festering trailers made for a far cry from the professional accountant who enjoyed oat milk lattes and used sweetener instead of sugar to spare her teeth. But there was no denying she was the connection. There was photographic proof she'd lived in that building. If I wanted to get ahead of this, to really understand what was going on, I'd have to figure out what had happened to those bodies. I'd pretty much exhausted my favors with the police, and truth was, they didn't know any more than I did. But it turned out the building was still standing, condemned, but they hadn't demolished it. Partly because no one wanted to take responsibility, but I reckon it might have been something to do with the biohazard warnings slapped on every single window and door. Good thing I'd brought a gas mask. I waited for sunset, geared up, and entered through the unlocked door. First thing that hit me as the door opened was the smell. Similar to the trailer park, but full pelt and hot as hell. Made me think of lizards and poorly kept terrariums. Strong enough to make my eyes water even through the mask. One thing was clear as I took a look around the hallway. The building was diseased. Not just run down or decrepit like the usual urban decay. This was something else. Looked like the inside of a clogged pipe. You know how limescale fills it up? It was a bit like that. This oily, rust-colored fluid had seeped down the walls and left them glistening and soft. Ropey stalactites of the stuff hung down from the ceiling like old party banners, and I edged around them afraid of what might happen if one touched me. Best guess was that stuff was digesting the place. Anything soft or organic was going or gone. Old umbrella frames were left standing in one corner, The fabric burnt or dissolved away. The carpet was reduced to just a few patches no bigger than my hand, and a bunch of old cardboard boxes piled up under the stairs had turned squat and half liquid, almost flowing down and around each other. The worst came when I took a look in the back room. Wouldn't have gone in, but something caught my eye. A well-worn shoe that wasn't covered in that oily shit. Sign of recent activity. That and the way the door was ajar just raised my suspicions. So I took a look. Even now, the timeline eludes me. But someone, a vagrant most likely given the way they were dressed, died a nasty death in there. Chemical burns come to mind. They were balled up in one corner, eyeless, looking up at me as I pushed the door open to take a closer look. Pink flesh threaded with red blood vessels, yellow bones poking through here and there. From the looks of things, they'd been trying to work the door open. You could see a history of their escape attempts left by bleeding hands. Rust-colored finger streaks ran all along the door's edges. Special attention paid to the hinges. And he'd broken the only window and tried hauling himself up there, only to realize it was barred from the other side. The jagged glass that still clung to the frame was covered in old blood. His palms must have looked like grated cheese. Eventually, he'd given up and lain down in that shit, and the thought of it made my chest feel heavy and tight. I'd only been in the building a few minutes, and that shit was already eating through my shoes. I could hear the thick rubber soles sizzle and pop with each step. But that guy had been forced to sit down in an inch-deep puddle of the stuff, likely because his exhaustion had left him no choice but to tough it out. So how long had he tried staying upright? Hours? Days? Weeks? Him getting stuck in there had to be deliberate. I was sure of it, a feeling in my gut. Someone had locked the door behind him and left him to die slowly. God only knows why. But did that mean they were still hanging around and waiting for a chance to get to me? Looking around, I sure didn't feel safe or alone. The shadows seemed too deep, and the steady drip, drip, drip of that rancid oil oozing out of every surface was too monotonous. Someone or something lived in that filth, and chances were they'd been responsible for that poor vagrant's agonizing death. That meant getting out of that shithole was a priority, so I made for the stairs and started the climb. If there were any answers in that place, it'd be in the apartment where that old man died. The crime scene tape was still hanging off the door frame when I found it, and the TV and sofa, or what remained of them, stood in the same place as in the photos. Back in the day, the old man had been a hoarder, and I was surprised the crime scene hadn't cleared all his shit out. It was all still there, only what had once been a chest-high maze of papers and magazines was now just a kind of hardened pulp, almost like magma, dried mid-flow. The whole fucking place was covered in the stuff like a coral reef, growing up the walls and even patches of the ceiling. Looked a hell of a lot like a wasp's nest, and it looked to be the source of that oily-looking fluid. You could see it sweating out of every crease and fold in that strange hive. It was almost hypnotic to look at. Glistening amber beads oozing out of papery sheets that flowed like rock striata. There was a gentle, barely perceptible rhythm. Hypnotic. I don't know why, but I reached out and ran the tip of my finger as gently as I could along the surface. It felt like the underside of a mushroom. All those papery gills, gossamer thin, soft, and inviting. I wore no gloves, and the brief moment of contact had deposited a single bead of that strange syrup on my fingertip. It caused a tingling sensation that was not entirely unpleasant. Even the blood that trickled down my knuckle felt warm and wet, like testing a hot bath with your hand. I liked it, and I wanted more. I went to reach out and push my arm into the rest when a hand burst out of the nest and gripped my wrist. I was so surprised I didn't even make a noise, but instead wordlessly fell back as the hand pushed me away from the nest. A very nearly skinless forearm followed, and soon after, a face emerged from the papery nest like a grime-covered nightmare. Black eyes and a lipless mouth. It was a man that could have passed for a corpse, like a half-digested piece of meat. Terrified, I struggled to my feet and realized that this person had broken damn near every bone in my wrist with that single grip. "Your meat smells raw," he growled before heaving himself out of the nest in a disgusting parody of childbirth. My sanity flickered, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground floor with bleeding eyes and both hands frantically pulling at the door handle. My mind returned in pieces. I blinked red tears away, but didn't stop trying to open the door. I felt it, that urgent need to leave, like a suffocating man feels the need to breathe. But I'd fucked up bad. I'd sniffed out the closet and saw the trap laid there, but hadn't seen the larger one set for me. There was only one way in and out of that building, and I hadn't jammed the door open. Now it was shut, and nothing I did could get it open. With more time, maybe I could have pried the jam or even kicked it down, but my heart was racing and my vision blurring. I wanted out of that place, a hot primal need to get the hell out. The air was too hot, my mask too stifling. Sweat condensed on the inner plastic and made it damn near impossible to see, and the pain in my wrist was a throbbing explosion that made sensible thought impossible. I'd realized early on into my little foray that I was underprepared, but the scale of what that meant eluded me until I was there, wrestling with thoughts of exposure, contagion, and disease, fumbling at a greasy doorknob with a broken hand while suppressing thoughts of what might be crawling up my leg or back or neck. Panic threatened to consume me. The world and all the normality it represented was right fucking there. I could hear it, the distant hum of traffic, the amber glow of streetlights that lit up the biohazard posters. Not 30 minutes ago, I'd been there, safe and far away from this waking nightmare. I was being reduced to a prey animal. Even in the moment, I could sense it happening to me, being made into something lesser, but it was like my actions were no longer my own. When I finally gave up on the front door, I turned around and saw the shadows way back at the hallway begin to shift as something descended the stairwell. There was no other way out, no door, no window. Just me, a long corridor, and a nightmare coming right at me. Something inside me gave up. I don't know how to describe it. I'm still not sure if it was that building or that strange fluid that seemed to warp my own thoughts. Or maybe there's just too much one person can go through. But I could practically hear the thin membrane of my sanity tear as I fell backwards into the door and slid down onto my ass, breathlessly awaiting my terrible fate. I almost contemplated turning off my light, but by then it was too late. I could see him coming towards me. He was legless. Nothing from the waist down except blackened viscera trailing up the stairs behind him. He pulled himself towards hand over hand with hungry eyes. Before I knew it, he was on top of me, one hand gripping my mouth with a salty palm, the other stroking my hair. And then in an instant, his demeanor changed. He pulled back with a terrified cry and scrambled away like I'd just stuck him with a blade. No, he muttered. No. You should have said, I didn't know. I thought you were another one I didn't know. I thought you were here for me. I didn't know you were hers. He cowered away, pedaling on both hands backwards while keeping his eyes fixed on me. Tell her I did not know you were hers. I could not smell until I was very close. If I hurt you, I'm sorry. Tell her I am sorry. I did not mean to hurt you. It is just I do not get to eat often, and I am always hungry. With a rapid gesture, he threw the key for the door at me. It skidded across the floor and fell just short of my feet. Tell her I did not know. What are you? I stammered. He looked at me curiously, stopping his retreat only briefly to gauge my expression. She likes to be seen, but I looked without asking and I got what I deserve. Who are you talking about? He very nearly laughed, but with such deformities it was almost a drooling guffaw. You know. Don't be stupid. You're in love with her. Just like me. But different. You got permission. I didn't. But she was good. She left me in an old nest to live in. And I have permission to eat anything I kill or trap myself. Hard now that people know to stay away, but sometimes I get lucky. His eyes flicked to the closet with sickening hunger. What has this got to do with her? I asked. What color are her eyes? He replied, almost manic with excitement. Answer. Tell me, what color are her eyes? I stopped. The word felt wrong in my mouth. Brown. No, he chittered. None of those. He raced forward momentarily and gripped my lapels with twisted glee. Compound, he hissed with such forbidden pleasure. Her eyes are compound. She's jealous of us, you know? Jealous. We get to love her. And then he disappeared into the darkness. Something inside of me gave way entirely, and I passed out. I don't know much of what came after, exactly. I was found a few hours later in my car, idling at a traffic light. I'd made some effort at getting away on my own, but didn't get very far. No surprise here, but I got sick as a dog going into that place. A deep chest infection, the kind that scares everyone at least once in their life. Only fair given how fucking stupid I was. But forgive me, I hadn't anticipated nightmares beyond human comprehension. I challenge anybody to think that fucking far ahead. You think junkies, you think flies, squatters. But that guy, that man slipping out of the nest and barreling towards me on two hands, my mind going sizzle pop along with the soles in my boots. In real life, shit like that always sneaks up on you. So I paid the price. 6 months. 6 long months. I got every fever you can think of. Sepsis, kidney failure, liver failure. Month after month drowning in my own fluids, coughing up shit that made nurses gag and leave. I asked the doctor what the long-term effects will be, and he winced before reading a list of things that didn't leave much hope for a happy retirement. And if it was hard on my body, it was even worse on my mind. Those fever dreams. Doctors say what I remember in that building, that was all just part of the sickness. Say I spent a good 3 days in a coma and strange dreams are the norm. Which I might accept if it weren't the fucking skin graft still healing on my right hand. No one can explain that. My client visited. Just the once. There are universally sad moments in life, and one of them is realizing someone you have a lot of affection for doesn't have it back. They have some, just not the same amount. It was always one way, though, wasn't it? I saw her every single day, but if I was doing my job right, she only saw me once a month for our meetings. Our arrangement ended not long after, so I hope anyway. She left like it was nothing but me. Jesus, it felt like someone excavated my heart right out. Even after she told me why she was there, even after what I did, I could barely stand up straight. I was so heartbroken. There were times after that I wished the sickness would just take me. Maybe that defeatism is why it got so bad. Who knows? She came to me looking for a recommendation, of all things. She wasn't cold, far from it. But there was a sense of disappointment as she sat beside me and eyed me up.
I liked the initiative, she said after a while, but the results leave me unimpressed.
What the fuck happened in that place? I asked, and even though I could barely hear my own voice, she seemed like she heard every word. For a moment, the way she contemplated it, I thought I was going to get a straight answer.
You know, my mother said men don't see ugly women. They know they exist, but they just poof them right out of their mind, like a magic trick. She said we worked better being a little plain, good enough to take home for a night. Any more and we'd start to leave problems everywhere we go. That guy was a problem. She was trying to warn me about the dangers of attention, but silly me, I went and got addicted. I hoped with you there might be a degree of separation, infatuation on a contractual basis.
She took a deep breath like she'd had a long, hard day.
I don't know. Maybe Mom was right. It's ridiculous, I suppose. The fly shouldn't admire the spider. It either sees it and fears it, or doesn't know what's coming until it's too late. I think Mom was telling me to go for the latter. It's no fun being invisible, though. You spent all that time looking at me, following me. What did you see?
I looked at her until my eyes watered and something throbbed in my skull. I don't know. I tried to lie.
Be honest.
She looked right at me, and something in the air changed. I don't know what. Hot. Jesus, it was hot. Like looking at the sun. I remember the heart rate monitor going nuts, and then I remembered gossamer wings and serrated chitin, a tick on the inside of your cheek, a leech on your tongue, a horsehair worm that won't leave the skin. And then an instant later, my eyes refocused and there was just a normal woman in front of me. Someone I could have loved, I answered, unable to stop the words spilling like vomit. Someone who I thought deserved love.
See, she said, who wouldn't like your version better?
I was crying again. Heart racing. World like butter, going soft at the edges. Whatever she did, it was like undergoing brain surgery in real time.
I'd like a recommendation,
she said after another minute or two of silence.
I'd like to see myself. I look in the mirror and I don't see what you do. I'd like an artist to paint me, a version of me, at least. It won't be easy on them. All this time, you've probably looked directly at me for no more than 5-10 minutes total. Just didn't realize it. Always the back of my head or my hair obscuring just so. That won't do. I want a portrait. I want to know what you see.
What will you do to them?
I won't do anything. Not intentionally. But if you ask someone to paint the sun, expect them to go blind. Whoever paints me will be painting the sun in their living room. Going blind is the least of their problems. Now, fess up. You know someone. You mentioned them once in passing. A cousin, maybe? An artist in need of cash? I'm sure of it.
Why would I tell you anything?
Because you love me,
she said.
And because despite everything you will get better, and you will come back to me. Year or two, I think. You were adamant I have no hold on you. And you will think that for a long time. And this period of freedom, you'll enjoy it only by my good grace and mercy. You did a good job. Better than any before. I've read your notes and reports over and over and seen details of myself I didn't even know were there. It's a thing of beauty, what you did. And one day soon you'll come back to me with some excuse for why you want the contract to continue.
I tried to spit the word never, but managed, at best, a weak shake of the head. Something that put a most peculiar smile on her face.
It doesn't work like that. It'd be like trying to brute force your way through Alzheimer's. You'll be back. Even now, you're mine. All mine. I'm just being gentle. And you're going to give me the name and number of this artist. Because even though you know I could no more love you than a spider loves the fly, you are desperate to please me. Because when I broke the man in that apartment building, when I tore him in two and told him that he would live for as long as I desired, writhing without air for years and years, drowning in sickly fluids and trapped helplessly in a hive he is determined to maintain, even though I wouldn't be caught dead going back there. He was grateful. And with time, you'll be grateful too.
She put the pen in my hand, smiled, mouthed the words, "Good boy," and God help me. I gave her my nephew's number.